Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm Deb Fellman, your host. Welcome to the channel. This is where we cover all things related to education, the good, the bad, the ugly. Unfortunately, often it is more of the bad and the ugly. Um, Tonight, I am welcoming a repeat guest, my friend Truman, to the program. I say program, but it's not like I have a regular scheduled slot or anything to the channel. And he's going to talk to us about sort of a continuation of a story he began telling me in his first interview some months ago. So if you haven't watched that, I encourage you at some point to go back and watch the background on this, because we're not going to do a ton of background. We're going to talk more about the really current issues that he's dealing with, or that he wants to talk about around what happened in the past with his role in education. Please take a moment to like the video, share the video out so we can get other people to see this live and be able to ask their questions while Truman is here. And let's get started. So Truman, welcome back to The Reason
Thanks
We
for having
Learn.
me.
You're
Appreciate that.
very welcome. So when last we spoke, you were kind of catching us up on what happened with your own kind of case. You were trying to deal with, union people and the job you'd had in the public schools in Wyoming. And the background on that was that you worked in the behavioral side, right?
Yep. I worked in the behavior support system. Um, I was in the tier 1 room, which is the most intensive kids that are self-contained, right? And so these are the kids that can't be out in the regular ed classrooms because of, just behavioral issues. It's not the same as, a kid who might have like extreme autism or Downs or something like that. It's a different thing. Although the learning disabilities can certainly feed into the behavior side of things and often do. But yeah, I worked with the most intensive kids that we had, the kids who we'd have to lock the building down sometimes, or we'd have to do, CPI moves to try and bring them down to a room where they would be secluded because they were so escalated that they had turned violent or, a threat to themselves or others. And so that was the kind of kids that I worked with.
Now, would you say that it was that were most of them that were there due to some kind of an organic problem of some kind of a chemical imbalance or mental illness that didn't have anything to do with their education? Or were there a fair number of kids in there who you felt like were the product of the education system, in terms of maybe they wouldn't have been there if kind of thing?
That's a really good question. To be honest, so I'm not like a professional when it comes to diagnosing, but what I can say is that to be totally honest, the kids that we worked with for the most part were ones that did have severe behavioral issues. I didn't see them as, for the most part, as kids that had just, gotten a bad rap, or that it was some teachers and regular ed's fault. There were obviously some, like, maybe this one kid had this one problem with this one teacher. But for the most part, these were kids that had probably over 50% really rough home lives, lots of behavioral diagnoses, very low academically, that were behind either because of some type of disability they had where they were behind in their reading, and how that impacts everything else, or it was a behavior where I mentioned this before, where the behavior and the academics feed itself. So if a student gets frustrated and has behavior issues, and then 3 minutes into math class every single time they're telling the teacher to eat shit, and then they get kicked out,
Right.
and then they're missing math, and so now they have an academic deficiency that is fed by the behavior thing, or vice versa. Maybe they don't understand it,
Right.
and so then they're getting the behaviors and the frustration are causing it. But to answer your question, I really can't think of any kid who I looked at and was like, oh, this is a product of the system or anything like that. Now, there were certainly kids that didn't need to be in our specific program. And, I mentioned that before, where the classroom teacher that I worked alongside was extremely unstable, and she wanted to be the person, and the mother figure for these kids. And so she would, allow them to just completely circumvent any protocol for
Mhm.
establishing the needs of a kid, doing IEP meetings, running through like evaluations and stuff,
Mhm.
and so she would just say, I'll take them, I'll take them. And the principal is more than happy to send kids down into our room,
And what
whether or not it was
ages are
appropriate
we
for them to be there.
just for the audience, like, what age groups are we talking about? Ages, grades?
Middle school. So sixth, seventh, eighth. Yeah.
6th,
We
7th,
had
8th.
one
Okay.
kid that was a fifth grader actually that got kicked out of elementary school, and he spent the second half of his fifth grade year with us because he was so intensive. But that's the only,
Okay.
I mean, yeah,
Okay. So this is that's a tough set of years for a lot of kids, right?
yeah,
And so
pretty
it's probably
formative.
right. So it's probably especially bad for that particular population, I would think, because you've got so many things going on. There are organic issues, and there's academics are getting more challenging anyway. Then you've got hormones, and you've got
Yep.
all of that. It's a lot. Okay, so now this week you got some bad news, right, about one of the
Yeah.
kids that had been a student of yours, correct?
Yeah. Well, but before we even get to that,
Okay.
let me talk to you about just something that even happened prior to this. I had told you about, I believe the last time we spoke, I talked to you about this student who I had, I believe it was the 2018 to 2019 school year, eighth grader, who, when he first came in, he used to sleep all the time and, would just fuck this, fuck that, and just, didn't really care. And I was able to work with that kid quite a bit. And by the time he left, the end of his eighth grade year, his literacy had improved significantly. He was still probably reading on a third or fourth grade level, maybe closer to fourth, knocking on the door of fifth, but it was a lot better than where it had been. He was able to read entire books on his own, like he read through like Percy Jackson and stuff.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, and he was able to do history projects and so on and so forth. And so he was still he's one who actually that would fall into that category of the behavior and the academics kind of feed each other, where he would be embarrassed if the teacher called on him or wanted him to, do something in class. And so he would act out, and get kicked out so he wouldn't have to be in that situation. And his academics suffered and I think it was there. He also had some, learning deficiencies. But he was doing really well whenever we sent him out at the end of his eighth grade year, in terms of relative to where he was when he came in.
Right.
And whenever he got up to the high school, one of the problems that we saw is that, there was it's not a bad thing for there to be, kind of some autonomy for buildings in certain areas. You don't want the superintendent micromanaging everything in these
Mhm.
programs, but for there to be no continuity between behavior support programs, especially transitioning from middle school to a high school setting, is crazy. It is, we talk about the stats of like how kids regress from summer break.
Yep.
Well, just multiply that by several orders of magnitude. And that's what happens when there's no like actual continuity between these behavior support programs. And when I say no continuity, I mean literally none, as in they will have entirely different systems. They will use entirely different data collection methods and metrics and so on and so forth. And like their tiers will be entirely different. Like it is such a night and day difference. And so what we saw, the high school behavior support program, which was helmed, actually, I don't think at the beginning of that year, but starting the year after, which would have been 19 to 20, by, if you recall in the story that I told you about the teacher who's, I love these kids, I love my job, but just was completely incompetent, who left the middle school after 2 years because she couldn't handle the behavior support program, went to go find herself or something, I don't know, and then came back and then was given the job of behavior support teacher at the high school, even though she was completely incompetent. So that's the type of quality that they had at the high school. And I promise everything I'm saying here has a point. I'm building to a point. So this kid who was doing pretty well, but he was, again, still completely self-contained. I believe he might have had one or two regular ed classes that he was able to earn by the end of the year. The people from the high school would come, and we'd have one day where the kids who were transitioning from the middle school to the high school would interact with the high school program and meet those kids and the teachers. And teachers would say, you're not going to be self-contained when you come up here. You're going to be out in your classes. You're going to have all this. And they have this thing called co-teaching that's ridiculous, and we can talk about that later. That they put a lot of stock in. It's their pet project at the high school. So they took a kid like this kid that I worked with, and a kid who was self-contained, he was doing well, but he still needed that support, and just put him out entirely in regular ed classes. He might have had like a sped English or something like that, but he was not, it was night and day different in terms of the support he had when he left. And then they flunked him, which anyone who knows like the data on like holding kids back, it's very rare. Like it's a thing we used to do quite a bit. And we're learning, especially with the kids that have these pretty severe issues. It's something that is just not, it doesn't work. It actually hurts them in the long run, because it kind of implies that, oh, well, maybe they'll be able to, do, honors English next year or something like that. And that's just not going to be the case for a lot of these kids. They have to have a different thing in terms of what does it mean for them to graduate. But anyway, so he flunks, and then he gets some kind of support, but not a lot. And then the following year, which was this past academic school year, he flunked again. And this is a kid who should not be on a graduation track. Again, just because he was doing well in a completely self-contained arena, and he might have gotten up to a 5th grade learning, I don't even, or not learning, but reading. I'm not even sure he was quite there. To put that kid in an entirely different thing with no support is completely ludicrous. And then what happens? And by the way, I'm not saying that the flunking was part of it. But this is a kid who is just like, fuck everything. Like, what's the point? That kid tries to kill himself about a month and a half ago, something like that. Thank God he fails. And he's able to go and get some help. And he's, I think back up at the high school and is getting some help. I was able to talk to him maybe 2 weeks ago. And it was good to talk to him and to hear how he was doing. But that's a kid who the system failed in a lot of ways, right? Because they're not meeting him where he is. And so there is clearly some kind of breakdown between what his needs are and what they're providing. We had another kid who was in our program that was the same age as this kid, who was involved in a homicide. He accidentally shot one of his friends and killed him. This was last year.
Oh my God.
Right? Yeah. That's a whole nother thing. And this kid's family is a whole nother can of worms. But that's still like pretty fucking crazy, if you ask me.
Well, can I ask a question?
Go for it.
And I'm truly, because I'm just curious. So what you often hear from people when there are kids who behave poorly at school, or they have behavior problems, and they show up at school because that's where they spend most of their time. A lot of people blame the home. And as you've pointed out, the home is unstable. In many of their cases, they do come from troubled homes. They do come from unstable home lives.
Sure.
But what I've been trying to say on my channel, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that public school takes all comers. Like it takes everybody, regardless of what the home life is.
Yeah.
And to an extent makes an implicit promise to the child, if not to the parent, right? That during the hours of whatever, whatever you're there, they're going to do their level best to, get you an education, to get you that, free and appropriate public education, right? And to provide you with whatever the supports are you might need to get that, to access it. So if your behavior issues are getting in the way of you accessing the educational, lessons, materials, then they're going to provide you with people who know what they're doing and how they can help you and so forth. So there's this implied partnership with like home and school that, kids are not just going to be warehoused. They're not just going to be penned. They're not just going to be kept in this building while they're not in the home building and so on. And that while it's probably imperfect because it's, it's public and everything, that's sort of the gist of it, that's what they're saying they're going to do. Otherwise, one would hope they would say, oh, you come from a troubled home life and have problems. We can't, like private schools would say that, right? Private schools might say, we can't take this on because we don't have this expertise, or we can't help this child because we won't be able to provide the supports this child needs. They need a specialized environment, right? But public says, nope, bring everybody. Bring everybody. We can take everybody. We will adapt. We'll deal with it, right? That's kind of the promise, so to speak. Am I?
So it's not implied and it's not a promise. It's actually legally mandated.
Oh, okay. So even
So if a child
more
is
than that.
on an IEP or a BIP, they are legally required to receive services from the school district based on their individualized education plan or
Right.
the behavior intervention plan. It is a federal crime to not provide services
Right.
to those kids. And I believe that's an IDEA violation. There might be another one that I
Yeah,
there's
I kind
another
of knew
acronym
that,
like
but I
that.
mean, but the
Right. I know.
reason,
Yeah.
but what I'm saying is, I'm also setting it up for the audience to understand that while, yes,
Yeah.
it is a federal law and a federal criminal thing, there's also a cultural expectation. And the reason
Yeah.
I want us to also remember that, because I think a lot of people are very glib when this federal laws, they break that all the time. They don't do that,
Right.
whatever. For dyslexia, they're not going to do it for behavior issues. But I want people to understand that the next time somebody's tempted to go, well, the parents, well, the home life, and
Right.
the home life may be terrible and the parents may be
Yep.
completely unstable. But remember that there's a lot of money from all the parents who aren't that kid's parents, okay?
Yep.
And all the taxpayers who aren't even parents going into the system that says, we mandate that this will happen and we will hire and pay for these people. So the cultural expectation over the years is that it will occur. So
Yep.
it's two pieces. I just want to make sure we keep them both there so people remember next time they're tempted to go blame society or blame outside the school, that the school has said both legally and culturally, we're the center of all things.
You can trust us with your kids for a third of their day.
Correct.
Minimum.
So that's the
Yeah.
point I'm trying to make. Obviously, I knew it was
Yep.
like mandatory.
Right.
I
No, I
just
know.
meant, isn't it kind of implied that everyone outside the school is not to blame
Yep.
because we got it? We got this. Leave it to us.
Yeah.
Just had to make that point.
Totally. And that's not to say that the outside stuff isn't a factor,
No,
but
it's a
it is to
factor.
say that the school takes that into account and still is supposed to do their damnedest to help these kids. And that's kind of the point. The thing that I would always say was, even if these kids' lives are a hurricane of chaos and stress and abuse and relational turmoil, at the very least, we can be the eye of that hurricane and provide them some sort of calm and stability and give them an environment where they know what to expect, even if everything else around them is just a total shitstorm. And that should be the minimum goal that is set by anyone in education, I think, especially that works with these vulnerable students.
How about do no harm? How about
Right.
that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That'd be a good low bar. I'd say it's a low bar, but when you can't even hit the low bar of do no harm, then it strikes me as really crazy to go and tell everyone outside the school, it's all y'all's fault. You didn't give us enough money. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. It's this, it's that, it's the other. You didn't give us enough respect. Whatever the reasoning is, I hope that people are starting to catch on that.
Sure.
Okay, fine, but when are we going to turn the microscope on y'all over here inside the school?
And moreover, Wyoming, where I live, is very unique. And anyone who works in the school system will hear what I'm about to say and go, holy crap, are you serious? We receive 100% reimbursement from the federal government for special ed budgets. So it doesn't, at the state, the county, they don't actually end up paying for anything that is a special ed budget. The federal government reimburses the district for 100%, which is an insane. That's why we have a significantly higher para to student ratio. Not that they use that very well. We have more counselors, we have more psychologists in our buildings than almost any other state because we have that reimbursement. So on top of what you're saying, how it's like people saying, well, they might say, well, we need more money or we need this, we need that. Where I live, that's not even an excuse. Now, they still will use it as an excuse because obviously, but that's not even an excuse where I live because
Right.
we have this, kind of goose that lays the golden egg whenever it comes to funding for our special ed departments.
Right.
So back to kind of what I was talking about with these kids. And again, please interject anytime you have a question or a thought or something. So out of a program that we'll say between 18 and 19 might have had 8 kids in it for the self-contained. One of them a few years later tries to kill himself. Another one a year later is involved in a homicide. We have other stuff that happens I'm not going to get into. Those are just 2 of the most egregious ones. Let me talk to you a little bit about what the 19 to 20 school year was like. And, some of this might be repeat. I don't think it will be as much, and not that anyone's going to have it super fresh in their mind anyway. But to kind of tee up a little bit of what happened recently. So the 2019 to 2020 school year, I'm again in the tier 1 behavior support room. We have a new tier 2 teacher who's actually competent because I love my kids, I love my job or whatever, she left. And things were on track. They were actually doing pretty well. Or at least they were set up to do well. They were primed for success. And the person whose room I was in, I believe I called her Karen in previous videos. We'll stick with that. Karen, she, just to give the kind of Cliff Notes version for people, whenever I say she was unstable or erratic, I don't mean that in like hyperbole. We use a lot of hyperbole to describe people these days. Like someone might say, oh, the Democrats are insane or something like that. Whenever everything I'm talking about here, any adjective I use to describe this person, I mean with 100% sincerity. I choose it carefully and it's not an exaggeration. So this is a person who had admitted that she, again, like I mentioned earlier, wanted to be these students' person. She liked to unintentionally get them amped up over nothing. She wouldn't follow their response sequence. And then when it get escalated, she wanted to be the person to come in and rescue them. It was serious, like Munchausen's. It was totally insane. She would often just break down into tears over, she was very insecure. And that's, by the way, whenever I read here in a little bit, the letter, that one version of it's going to go to the local newspaper, the Laramie Boomerang, and another version that's a little bit more detailed is going to go to the school board. Both these are going out Monday morning. I'm not going to mention her name. The reason for that, even though her name's going to be in the one that goes to the board, is because this person, despite all the harm she did, I think is just mentally ill, and she shouldn't be with students, and she needs help. She admitted that multiple times. That she needed help. She admitted that she had problems with men,
Right.
specifically because of issues with her father. This isn't me guessing or Monday morning quarterbacking. These are
So she's
her
telling
words.
you.
She's telling, yeah. And so she would admit that she had moments of lucidity where she's like, I'm asking too much of these kids, basically. And because she was expecting emotional fulfillment from how they responded to her. That's why she also multiple times told me that she was envious of me because I connected with them and had, these relationships with them, and they loved talking to me and trusted me and talked about how much they liked me, and not her, even though I was way more severe. And when I say severe, I mean, I just followed the program. I
Right.
enforced consequences for them. And she told me that she was jealous and that it made her feel resentful toward me, and not just me, any other person who had that with kids. She wanted to be their person. These are again her words. So anyway, so I was in Karen's room, and she another thing she would do is, like I said, she would often cry because she was insecure, and maybe someone said something, like she had some interaction with a faculty member or something, and it made her feel bad. So then she would just leave the room to run around to try and get people to validate that she's a good teacher, and I'm not kidding. At one point, I kept track of how often she was out of the room, especially when she was supposed to be teaching.
Mhm.
And it was just about 50% of the day. This is I think it was a 1 or 2 week average where she was out 50% of the day. And that's not including, I wasn't tracking like when she should have had breaks or lunches. This is when she's supposed to be in the classroom teaching, and she just leaves, me to pick up the pieces. Oftentimes with kids who are not supposed to be with just one adult, we need multiple adults, because especially if it's like mixed sex, then we need to have multiple people in there. Anyway, so this year, this was the 2019-2020 school year, and there was a student who he was an 8th grader. He ends up having, because of the way this person wanted to run the program, she used to be a special ed English teacher, and she wanted to keep doing that, even though she had signed up to be the tier 1 behavior person, which means she probably shouldn't be doing, academic classes for kids that aren't in the tier 1 system, but whatever, that's what she wanted to do. And so no one fought her on it, because she created a very unstable environment where you couldn't criticize, you couldn't push back, because she would blow up or take it the wrong way. Anyway.
And for the people who didn't watch the first video where you talked about this in depth, they're probably wondering now, if she was doing these things so openly, why didn't anybody intervene? Why weren't there any other? Did she have a supervisor? Were there any people reviewing her work and who said, we've got a person who has her own issues, who's working with kids, because I know if I were just in the audience right now, I'd be thinking, how did this occur? Why didn't anybody notice? Right?
Sure. I address a little bit of that in the letter that I'm going to read, but the kind of TLDR for people, again, I would highly recommend them go back and watch those conversations we had about it. But the short version is myself and a school psychologist and another teacher did file complaints. And in the end, it made the administration look really bad, because they knew we had asked them to intervene for the entire school year, and they didn't. And the principal is the one who didn't intervene. The board had wanted to actually fire this principal, but the superintendent stood up for him. And then a week later, everything blew up in our behavior support program. Everything comes out how completely fucked up it is. And now there's a problem through the chain of command, right? Where this looks really bad on the principal, because he didn't do anything about this. In fact, one of the first things he said whenever things went bad was about the optics. He was complaining about the optics of it. Those are his words. And the superintendent had just stuck his neck out for this guy. And so now he tied his political career to this principal. And by the way, this principal had gotten his previous school district sued for doing the same thing that he was doing in our building, which was completely circumventing legal protocol for kids when it comes to developing plans and figuring out what to do for them, and just shoving them down in behavior support programs. He got his previous school district sued, and they told him, hey, we're not going to renew your contract, so you probably need to resign. And so he did, and then he came to our building.
So we're starting mentally to make a list of incompetence supported by incompetence supported by incompetence. And explain to us, please, what is the process that you go through to get hired to have, it's bad enough, I think, for a classroom teacher. And we parents have seen over the past year, we've seen that teachers are being deputized to be almost, therapists in classrooms right now with this social emotional learning garbage and everything. But one would hope that the process that people who are in behavioral support go through to get hired or trained or whatever would involve some measure of vetting, not just for training or a degree or something like that, but like personality and that this woman didn't throw any red flags to anybody says something in itself, right?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And by the way, if you want to go down a rabbit hole of where I think SEL is getting a bad rap, I'm happy to do that, because I think that the right is freaking out about SEL in a way that's probably inappropriate. But that's a whole
just to briefly touch on that for the audience there, SEL used to be something useful. And unfortunately, as with most things, it got politicized. So the
left corrupted it. Peter Boghossian calls progressive ideology a universal solvent. And that's absolutely correct. And the way I would say, the best way to put it is, SEL is to woke bullshit as a 1619 project is to history. History is a
Exactly.
good thing. Whenever you inject the 1619 project in it, that's a bad thing. SEL, when done properly, and I've seen this, that's why I'm speaking from experience. The same with restorative justice, by the way.
Yeah.
When done properly by competent people, is a great thing for kids who with behavioral issues. The problem is that being done properly is now the exception rather than the
Right.
rule. But it's been corrupted the same way history and any of these other things have been corrupted by this progressive ideology.
Okay, and I promise you right now that I will have Truman back on to dive into that rabbit hole on SEL, okay? But if you're interested in learning more about SEL as it's currently manifested, you know, like what it's
Yep.
being what that term is being used
Especially with
for.
gender stuff and sexuality
Right.
stuff. Yeah.
There are several videos on my channel that you can go through and find it, cover it. And Jason Littlefield was here to talk about it. So as Truman said, and even Jason says this, that SEL was great. You know, it did a
Yep.
lot of good. But unfortunately, like he said, you know, his teaching history is great too, until you start teaching some kind of communist version of propaganda. So it's
Exactly.
the same with, you know, you take a perfectly innocuous term like SEL and
Yep.
attach it to you know what Jason calls, you know, successor ideology or some other kind of ideology that is not
Yep.
what it was intended to be, and now it's a bad thing.
Yep.
So, you know, you really have
It's
to
been
dive in
perverted.
and find out what people are complaining about, and unfortunately, we have to speak in shorthand lately with things
Yep.
like CRT or SEL, because otherwise we'd spend, you know, 3 hours explaining it to you
Yep.
every time. So, I promise we'll go into that on another show, but I'm sorry, Truman, didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make
No,
sure
you're good.
we get
No, you're
that
cool.
across. Mhm.
That's just the thing that I bring up every time because I really try super hard to be as objective as possible about these
Sure. Yeah,
things
I
and,
agree.
and
Mhm.
be nuanced, as because that's kind of lacking these days. Not saying that you're doing that. Obviously, I think you're great. But so to your question, you were asking about, I'm serious, but you asked about the way these people are hired. There's a few things there, the kind of, I think we're now 10, 15 years, probably 15 years from the documentary Waiting for Superman. That process is
Yes.
still very alive and well, in that it's very difficult to get rid of bad teachers.
Yep.
And so, they're not sending their best, for starters. The other thing is that these jobs are not super desirable. Working with these kids, they have a very high turnover rate. You could probably look at the turnover rate like in places that are residential facilities and residential homes for students, and see the same kind of thing where the average staff member probably is there for 6 months and then they can't handle it anymore. It's a similar kind of thing with these intensive kids. And the last thing is, whenever it comes to just the criteria, and I know we've talked about this, but for people who miss that, it's often, can you articulate, this is, and by the way, this is a big theme with leftist ideology, is can you articulate a goal really well? If you can articulate a goal really well, then we will judge you by the goal and your intentions rather than your ability to achieve those things. So, the teacher who I called, I love these kids, I love my job. I called her that because that's what she always would articulate in any type of situation when she was pressured
Mhm.
about like how she was doing. And so it's like, as long as you can articulate how much you care about kids, even if it's authentic, I'm not saying these people are faking.
Right.
They're not. But if you can articulate how much you care about kids, there is an assumed competence that goes with that.
Right.
And so by the way, this is a thing where if you translate it to any other thing that requires skill, obviously it makes no sense. It doesn't matter how passionate I am about airplanes. You should not put me in the cockpit of an airplane,
Right.
right? It doesn't matter how much I care about that airplane. It could be my number one priority in life is that airplane. I'm probably still going to crash that plane and kill everyone on board. And
Right.
so, but that ends up being the main thing is, do you have the degree, which it's
Right.
easy for any complete potato off the street to get these degrees these days, especially since a lot of curriculum, my wife went through this because she was getting her teaching, but whenever she got pregnant, the last thing she needed to do was do her student teaching. And that was it.
Right.
And she was talking about how like they're teaching you to read from a script in a book. This isn't
Yeah.
about can you develop a lesson plan, do all these things. It's can you read from a script in a book. So
Right.
it's they're not sending their best, and that's not. I'm not casting aspersions on all teachers. Just because a process isn't rigorous for people to get through doesn't mean good people don't go through that process,
Sure. Right.
right? But the point is that oftentimes the criteria, ends up being can you
Doesn't weed
articulate.
out the bad
Exactly.
ones.
There is no
And
sorting mechanism for people who are bad unless you're like a pedophile, and
well,
that's
and also
literally about it.
as you've mentioned before, the incentives, you got to follow the incentives.
Yeah,
So if the incentives don't align with producing results, like you said, if the incentives align with emoting or articulating a goal, and I
precisely.
felt that I think that's something that's endemic in public schooling in general, because when I was first teaching, and granted it was a long time ago, I took it very seriously. I came in from a graduate program where I was all about effectiveness. My goals were very, measurable, right? They were things you could put in a chart. And that didn't mean that I didn't develop relationships with the children. It just meant that I was looking to achieve very specific goals I could enumerate, right? And I was pulled aside at the end of that year because after my first year, you're not eligible for permanence yet. And I was told I wasn't nurturing enough.
Right.
And
Which
part
is
of that
insane.
was that every time I articulated my goals, they didn't have to do with I love my job, I love my kids. And
No.
so they'd say, "Well, you just don't seem very warm, and you seem this and you seem that, and you talk to them like you don't talk to them like they're little bitty children." I'm like, "Because they hate that."
You're not paternalistic enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so because I mean, I was a 23-year-old, how maternal was I going to be anyway? But I just thought it was bizarre because I had shown results. I'm like, but look at how the kids are doing. And they're like, yes, but we want to create a warm and welcoming and this and that and the other environment. So the incentive was to behave in a certain way or emote a certain way and demonstrate certain things, not to produce.
Yeah.
So the teachers who were the good teachers who got to stay, who got permanence, were the most warm and fuzzy teachers. In fact, the only teacher from our cohort who came in from graduate school who got hired within that district, in my estimation, was the least well qualified in
Sure.
terms of her technical expertise as a teacher. And remember, we were all good with the kid. Like there were no complaints about like, well, the kids don't like you and the kids aren't learning. She just was the one that was the bubbliest and the most, fit
And
the
probably a
type.
team player, right? She was probably a
And
team player for the
and that
system.
too. I kept
Yep.
saying, I think we can improve this more if we did XYZ. Well, that was not welcome either. So
Yep.
if the culture of your organization, just like the culture of any, private sector organization, incentivizes certain personality types or certain behaviors, that's what you're going to get more of. And people who aren't like that are either going to leave, not go there in the first place, not stick around. And the only reason I bring this up is the immediate thing that people go to is, well, the jobs aren't desirable because to good people because they don't pay enough.
Yeah. No, that's not it.
But it's not it's not. When you feel valued at work, when you feel supported and recognized at work for doing good work, when you actually have high quality standards for yourself
Yep.
and others, and that is appreciated, the money, believe it or not, is secondary. It's not, you need to live, but it's not the number one thing.
No one
And
goes into
really,
education for the money unless they're on an administrative track. Period.
correct. So people who go in the first place have already made that deal with themselves. And there's really not a number that's going to get the person who would otherwise be making $100,000 somewhere else to go, oh, I think I really will go work with behaviorally challenged children. That's not
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah.
It's
And
not
by the
going to
way,
happen.
I would
Oops.
love to get into kind of how that happens and how to conceptualize these institutions and their incentives here in a little bit, uh, which was kind of the thing I started to talk
Right.
to you
But
about
I
before
just
we went
wanted
live.
to, like, again, I hate to keep
It's
interrupting you,
important.
but
No, it's super
it's just
important.
really important to bring
Totally.
up because
Hmm.
a lot of the things that you're saying, I can kind of imagine, if I were just sitting on the outside looking in and I didn't know anything about any of this, I might think, well, maybe they need to be paid more, or well, maybe this, or maybe that, or maybe it's just one bad apple. And they're like, no, you tend to get a whole bushel full of bad apples when you incentivize bad appledom. That's just
Well,
what you
it's
get.
it's about the environment, and if we think about evolutionary pressures and what types of ideas and behaviors are selected, this environment will select these behaviors every
Right.
time. Every time, because it's been really well calibrated to do that, and it's evolved to do that.
Yeah.
So that's why any of these systems, by the way, that I talk about, I know that you talk about, and we mentioned in past conversations, this isn't these problems aren't isolated to this district or that district or whatever.
No.
There might be specifics here and there, this thing happens in Loudoun County or whatever, for example, but the system itself and the incentives within that system that turn out these results are universal whenever
Yeah.
it comes to our public education system.
No
Um,
doubt.
but yeah, so 2019 2020 school year, there is a kid who, like I said, this teacher Karen, call her Karen. I need to remember to read that.
Really unfortunate.
I picked it,
Yeah,
for a reason.
but I mean, it sort of
Um,
fits, doesn't it?
well, yeah, that's why I picked it. Yeah.
Yeah, these are
Um,
pseudonyms, by the way. That's why we're talking about, like, in case you didn't watch the other
Crazy bitch
videos.
seemed like it would have been a little over the top, for me to be saying every time. So I
So we
just,
chose Karen.
yeah.
Sorry, our apologies to any actual Karens in the audience. We are very sorry that your
Yeah.
name has been
So
abused.
surely they're used to it by now. Yeah, you think that's bad? What about those Adolfs? So
Oh
anyway,
God.
but yeah, so there's a kid who is put in 2 classes, and by the way, that so much of why this thing with this kid matters is because so much of what I'm about to tell you fueled a lot of the changes that we were trying to make at that school when things happened, when everything blew up at the end of the 2020 school year. Anyway, so which people can go back again and watch those videos if they want to see. But he gets put in this classroom with her to take. I think he had a reading class. And he had it was like a literature class and an English class, something like that. I don't think they call it reading for maybe they did. I can't remember. Anyway, and he for whatever reason, she just clashes with him. A lot of it I was able to see was that he just didn't give her what she wanted emotionally. And this was a pattern with this woman that whenever she would have a student, she would think that she was going to be a person for this student, that she was going to be their person, and that they were going to confide in her and trust her and give her all this validation. And this is I'm serious. This is exactly, she articulated this. And whenever the students didn't do that, she resented them for it and would take anger out on them for not giving her the emotional validation that she wanted. I saw her do this with lots of students in different situations. There was this pattern where, a kid would mention something like a kite, or something that's completely, out of the blue. And then instead of, continuing to do what she was supposed to do, which is coming up with regular lesson plans, she would last minute craft some entire lesson plan around that thing that kid mentioned to try and make them happy. And really, it was about trying to buy some kind of emotional purchase from them in terms of being their person.
Right.
Um, and this would often supplant actual curriculum and learning. Anyway, and then whenever that kid didn't have the response that she wanted, she'd scrap it. She would get mad. She would treat them poorly. And then she would start to feel bad. And then she would do the same thing over again and do some kind of thing. But these are mentally ill kids. And so to expect them to fill your emotional cup is just, that's why I say this woman herself had issues.
Right.
And actually, I was reading, as an aside, I don't know if you've ever read The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell. It's an amazing book.
Read
And he talks,
excerpts. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would go through the whole thing, man. It is a gold mine. And one of the things he talks about is the cycle of cave. I can't remember what word he gives it, but with single moms, and how single moms, they're good at making rules, but they're not good at enforcing them. And so the single mom will allow a kid to get away with, let's say bedtime, not going to bed at the right time for weeks or whatever. And then eventually she blows up because she's mad. She's mad at herself for letting them get away with all this stuff. And then she blows up, but it's completely disproportionate to whatever the incident was. And then she feels bad. So then she's lenient for another couple of weeks, but then she gets mad at herself. And it's just this cycle that repeats itself. It was crazy. As I was reading that book, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what this teacher is doing with these kids. Is the same thing that Farrell writes about there. Anyway, that's an aside.
Well, it's an aside that I can, as a mom who was, I don't know, I won't call myself a single mom, but a divorced mom. So I had, shared custody and so forth. And I'll tell you that that cycle is very real, even for somebody like me, where I kind of knew better, right? You don't have to be a parent at risk or in any kind of in an environment where you don't have education or something like that. I knew better, but it is a weird thing that happens when you're trying to co-parent and their kids are moving different houses and kids are getting pretty good at playing adults off each other and things like that, that it is actually it is a tough thing. I've been the first one to say that kids need a dad. They do. I mean, I think I'm a pretty good mom, but kids need a father. And there is a fundamental difference. And I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for saying this, but there is something to the dad. We saw in Louisiana a couple weeks ago, the dad's on duty, the fathers who just showed up at the school where they were having fights every single day. And they didn't have to say any magic words. They didn't do anything. They just walked around the halls with
They were
their
just
dad's
there.
on duty t-shirts, just being there, just being that presence. And the kids were like suddenly behaving. And when they interviewed some of the kids, and one of the girls goes, there's like a look, right? There's just a look. And I
Yep.
couldn't affect that look. I tried. I mean, I grew up in a household with a man who had that look. And I knew, you get the look and you're like, right? I
My dad had
couldn't
that
do
too.
it. My kids didn't believe me. And no matter how hard I try, and that cycle that you described is very real. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. It is very true. So I'm sorry. I just wanted to validate that. And as embarrassing as it is, I will tell you, I've been that person. Unfortunately, I've had a devil of a time disciplining. My
And
kids luckily are pretty good, and they don't
sure,
do anything really awful, but they take advantage. They do take advantage,
well,
unfortunately.
they're gonna do that. That's what makes
Yeah.
them kids, but or human actually. But and so honestly, that was part of the one of the things I didn't mention earlier with the kid who tried to kill himself. Um, I there's a lot of those kids from that program that basically they added me on Xbox Live. And so they talk to me and keep up with me. I got a message from a kid maybe 2 months ago that was I hadn't seen that kid in 2 years, and he was like, thanked me for being an adult who cared about him, that made an impact on him. Just out of the blue thing. And he'd moved away. He wasn't even in this district anymore. That kind of thing. But this is how fucked not to get ahead of myself, but it's kind of speaks to how I was able to bond with these kids who didn't have like male figures in their lives. That kid who tried to kill himself a month and a half ago or so, he actually, I don't even think it was a month and a half ago. I think about it, it was maybe less than a month ago. Anyway, I found out before anyone at the school did. They found out from me. The school, his TOR, his teachers, the program, everything. They found out from me because one of his friends reached out to me and said, "Hey, I know you're going to want to know this." Contacts me and is able to get me. He's the one who was able to facilitate me talking to the kid. And I contacted Seth, my school psych buddy, and I said, "Do you know this happened?" He's like, "Oh my God, I didn't." He contacts the teacher, from at the high school who are supposed to be the ones working with them. None of them knew. So they found out from the person who doesn't even work for the school district anymore, because I actually was able to form relationships with these kids, and these people have their thumb up their ass, and aren't actually keeping up with it. But that speaks to what you're talking about, of just the importance of having like that male in their lives. But anyway, so this so there's this kid, I don't know what to call him. We'll call him Sonny. He has these 2 classes with Karen, and like I said, she wasn't giving him what she wanted in terms of, or he wasn't giving her what she wanted in terms of that emotional gratification. And I noticed that she would just she wouldn't follow his program. She was extremely hard on him. She would be the least charitable in terms of just how she would interpret anything with him. She would enforce rules with him that she wouldn't enforce with other kids. It was really hard to see.
Right.
And I would often talk to the tier 2 teacher who was competent, who I found out later was a coward, but was competent and a genuinely nice person and competent at her job in a lot of ways. We would talk and lament about how this kid would just talk about how he felt worthless, how he didn't feel like he could do anything right, how nothing mattered.
Yeah.
I actually took a picture from his daily journal. It's blurry. You can't read all of it, but I can read the parts that say, "It doesn't matter what I do. She'll still, she'll move me. She'll do this. She'll do that. I feel worthless." And so that's what's happening with this kid, and why his situation. Well, there's several reasons why this is relevant. Is he starts to do what they had done was, I think after a couple months, and this is where it speaks to where their program, they're just flying by the seat of their pants. They pull him back to like halftime, where he went from being tier 3, where he like, I can't remember what happened. I think actually, you know what? Let me back up. I misstated that. Something happened behaviorally, where instead of following any type of protocol, they immediately moved him from tier 3, which is where you kind of check in the mornings, and at the end of the day, you might have like an SEL class or something like that. But otherwise, you're out in regular ed. He had some incident. I can't remember what it was. And the fact that it wasn't memorable means it was probably not a big deal, because I remember the big deal things.
Right.
And so they immediately pull him into where he's tier 2, which means you have half of your classes, 4 classes out in the regular ed classroom, and half of them are the special ed classes. And so that's when and this was maybe a month or so into the school year. I can't remember when. This is relevant, I promise. So that's when he ends up with these 2 classes with Karen. And she's just she's fucking horrible to him, Deb. I mean, just absolutely horrible to him.
And this is the same person. I love my job. I love my kids.
No.
Oh, this is a different person.
No.
So
I love my job. I love
Karen-
my kids. I love my job. I love my kids. Karen is the erratic, leaves the kids alone.
Oh, okay. This is the one who's just mean to them and abuses them.
Yeah.
Okay, I have my people confused. I have my people
That's
confused.
okay. I love my job. I love my kids. This is at the high school at this point in time.
I'm just messing people up there.
Yeah, it's okay.
Differently.
So anyway,
I'm not laughing. This is horrifying. You know what I mean? It's just
so anyway. So after a few, like maybe a month or so, Karen argues, well, because we would have this thing. We had a system where we would keep scores. We'd put in scores for students at the end of every class period.
Right.
And she says, "Oh, this Sonny's scores are going down. He's starting to slip. We need to pull him back to where he's completely self-contained, tier 1." And so I go back and look, and I'm like, that's not right. That can't be right. So I look, and I do a 1-month average, which is 16 class periods for every class he has, which is 8 classes. Right. And I tease out the data, and what I find is that in his 4 regular ed classes, over the course of that 1 month, his scores were going up. He was improving. He was consistently getting in the 80, 90%, which is our minimum was 70. So he's doing amazing. He has 3 special ed classes, or 3 classes that are part of like the SPED program or whatever. And again, SPED includes behavioral. This isn't like, SPED math or anything.
Sure.
Of those 3 classes, one of them is with that tier 2 teacher who is competent, and he's doing great in there.
Okay.
The other 3, 2 of them are with Karen, and his scores are shit in there because she's scoring him poorly. There was incidents where I could tell that she was like, would ask my opinion. Well, he probably didn't get this point, did he? And I'd be like, I don't know. I think he probably did. And she was like, she would get mad at me because I didn't want to like ding him on stuff that I didn't think he deserved to be dinged on. Anyway, so, and then there was a 3rd class that was some other literature class, actually. Maybe he didn't have a reading. Maybe he didn't have 2 lit classes with her. Maybe it was in English and some other thing. I can't remember. It might have been history, actually, now that I think about it. Right. But where this teacher, whenever I looked at it, his scores were really bad in this class. This teacher had only scored him 3 times over the course of a 4-week period, which is 3 out of 16 possible times to score him. And all of them were bad scores. So what that means is, or at least can be implied, because I actually went and had monitored a few of the classes in there with him. He was only scoring him when he had a bad day. So whenever he had a good day, he wasn't scoring him. So Karen was trying to wait. So let's say you have a class where the person inputs his scores 16 out of 16 times, and his average is 94%. And then you have this one teacher who's scoring him 3 times out of 16, and his average is 65% or 61%. She was weighing those the same, which is insane, right? Like, you get what I'm saying from a statistical standpoint?
Yeah, no, I get it. And I'm still like amazed that she had that this one person had so much power.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was a mixture of she happened to do the thing that the administration wanted, which was, I'll take those kids. I'll get them out of your hair. Yeah, I'll come and babysit them. It doesn't matter what the protocols are, or if we literally don't even have a chair in the room for them, I'll take them. And so it was just it was a completely toxic symbiotic relationship. Anyway, so I bring this data to her where I say, because she's like, he's failing. I say, look, here's his scores
Mhm.
in his regular ed classes, which are the ones you want to pull him out of. He's improving across the board week by week in all of them. He's doing really well in these classes. He's actually doing really well in this other class. The three that are dragging him down are these three. And
They're her
I
classes
had to
too.
be so fucking careful because she's insane. And I knew she would take it that way. And so I said, all I said was, are these three classes? And one of them, and I brought up about how that one teacher had only scored him 3 times. And I said, so this is, I said, we should actually not even be counting this because it's not, it's
Right.
overweighting, or it's weighted too heavily in the average when it shouldn't be there. If you
Right.
just look at this from a statistical standpoint, this is not, it shouldn't be included. But even if you do, it's these 3 classes that are doing it, and you want to pull him out of all the classes that he's actually succeeding in that he really likes.
Oh my God.
And she told me a decision has been made. This is above your pay grade. Because
Ah.
that was the end of the conversation. I was like, she's like, well, this is the decision, and I said, what good is this decision if we're making it based on faulty data? And I was as firm with her as I possibly could have been, where I'm like, this is a bad idea. I said, I'm sorry. You've told me I could be honest with you, which was of course not true, but I still had to be in this case. This is a bad idea. Why would we take him out of the classes that he's doing well in? It doesn't make any sense. And she gave some smoke that, well, if he's doing bad in these classes, it's going to bleed over. I don't know. She had some justification. And finally, I'm like, but you were making this decision on data that doesn't make sense. This literally doesn't make sense. It's going to go poorly. He's going to get worse from this. And that's when she said, this is above your pay grade. The decision's
And
been made.
where just for my own curiosity, because I actually really don't know how this works. Um, what gets told to parents when these things happen? So I would imagine the parents knew that he was in these classes, okay, and they may have even known how he was doing, right? Or did they have a sense of how he was
They know
doing? Or
some. I mean, this family, I believe, had 4 kids,
okay,
and they were actually a pretty like good family. They were good parents, as best I could tell. I believe it was mom and stepdad, if I recall.
okay,
They lived out in the country, but I think they were fairly responsive. I don't know how they were informed, but or how they were kept up to date on progress. But the way at the end of it, the decisions often came down something like this. So we would have a meeting every Wednesday. I think it was Wednesday. It was either Tuesday or Wednesday, something like that. After school, the behavior support team would meet. And there was a rotation of, we're going to talk about these 5 kids or whatever. People were going to update on how these kids are doing.
right,
And I was giving this data to her before where this kid's name was going to be presented, because she was saying, well, he needs to be pulled back.
right,
And so then what ends up happening is they meet, and you have people there who don't really care. You might have one person who's kind of invested in a kid, but the person who's covering and briefing people on that kid is kind of the person that they all defer to. So you might have 2 teachers or 3 teachers, one of which is like maybe works with the kids who have learning disabilities, who isn't even part of the behavior thing, but is just the department head or something. And maybe like one counselor and a principal or 2. And so if Karen says, next up, we have Sunny. If you look at the averages over the last 4 weeks, Sunny's scores have been declining. He had to get a reboot or, some disciplinary thing 3 or 4 times. I think that he should be pulled back to full-time self-contained. People would say the other people don't have any other information about it. The person who is making the argument is the one who they just defer to. So it is, and
and
I was in that
probably the
meeting,
parents do too, right? The parents just assume the
right?
person
And so
knows
then
what
the
they're
parents are
talking about.
informed. The parents are informed about the decision that has been made. So this isn't an IEP meeting. This is a different meeting. And so then the parents are informed, and they're informed by a teacher who's like, yeah, we're just really worried about this. That's what language they use. We're just really, and maybe they are. In this case, it was complete insane bullshit. But we're just really worried about so-and-so. And we think it's best if he does this, and the parents, especially if you're a busy parent, if you're working, like, you're going to say, yeah, whatever's best, like,
Right.
and maybe the kid has been having some rough stuff going on at home. And maybe the parent is like going to go, yeah, maybe they are struggling or something like that. Now, again, the data that's presented is completely ridiculous. It's like, okay, well, maybe he had these 5 discipline things and his scores are going down, but it's only in these 2 classes with the same teacher, and this other class doesn't count. And it's an entirely different thing to say. And we should probably remove him from all the classes where he's been consistently, without fail, improving for the last 4 weeks. We should take him out. Like, then people are going to go,
Right.
"What the hell are you talking about?" But that's just not how that
Right.
goes down. And it was a wonder that they even allowed me to be at those meetings, because I probably shouldn't have been. But I definitely couldn't say anything in those meetings. Anyway,
What would have happened if
let's
you
answer
had?
your question. My
Like, what if you said, "I think this is bullshit." Like, "I think she's wrong, and I think we're harming this kid. We shouldn't do this."
the principal would probably tell me to leave. To be honest, that principal probably would have said, "Why are you even in this meeting? You should leave."
So, it wouldn't have done any good, and you wouldn't have had any access to help this kid because you'd probably
Yep.
be out on your butt, right?
Yep. So, but
Yeah.
the thing was is that the result of me doing that, like, aggregate, looking at all that data and collecting it and teasing it out, that's what inspired the huge data collection system that I went on to pilot, where I took every kid in the building who was on an IEP, which was over 50 kids, and I created a Google Docs spreadsheet. And this is where, at the time, they were talking about, we need a data manager who can do this stuff and help provide robust data and synthesize what matters for these meetings.
Right.
And before, I got in the crosshairs of the administration, they were in the process of creating a data manager position, and I was putting a lot of hours in unpaid. I was, me and Seth would, walk to work, just because, walk and hang out. It was maybe
Right.
a 20-25 minute walk. And we'd get there at between 5:30 and 6, and I would be there unpaid, for months, working on that and inputting data and taking stuff out of our data system and putting it in there and coming up with. And then every 4 weeks, I would have a 4-week average spreadsheet where I would say, here's the average. And I would put, like, it was a really robust system. And I included in it how many possible entries there could have been for that kid and how many were actually inputted,
Mhm.
where it's like, so we know if the teachers are actually inputting the data. So if at the end of the 4-week average, we get one where it's, 2 out of 16 and the scores suck, it's like, well, you can't use that. In fact,
Right.
that's a teacher who we probably need to do an intervention with, to be like, why aren't you scoring these kids? You're legally required to do this. Anyway, but this student was this situation was the inspiration for that. And what got me heavily invested in that. And I watched him deteriorate. I watched him, write on, on pieces of paper. I have some of them somewhere. I kept some of them where he's like, "I'm a piece of shit." He spelled like peace wrong, or something. But um, "I'm worthless." And he crumbled. And then COVID hits, right? COVID happened after we had that big blow up, and people like Seth, who were supposedly being investigated. Again, people can go back and watch. I'm not going to fill them in. Basically, Seth, actually, I will a little bit. Seth blew up on Karen and was like, "You need to do your fucking job," in a meeting, and because she wasn't, and the administration wasn't doing anything about the issues of her just being a derelict teacher, and when she was there, being not the type of person to be working with those kids. And so we're supposed to be doing home checks and stuff whenever we're all out. Seth is railroaded. He doesn't get to do any of that. He ends up getting transferred. I've talked about all that ad nauseum. Fast forward, we've got the 20 to 21 school year, and now we're at the beginning of the 2021 to 22 school year. Almost a week ago, 6 days ago, Sonny killed himself. And he's 15 years old, and he's dead. Now, here's the thing. I don't know what the last year was like for him at the high school. I don't. It might have been great. It might have been. What I do know, and I was talking to Seth today to go over just some notes, some other stuff I want to talk to you about in terms of, like I said, how our reporting system for this stuff is just a completely embarrassing, dangerous shit show. But Sonny was a kid who wore his emotions on his sleeve. You could always tell when something was wrong. He would talk to you about it. He would want to talk about it. So the fact that somehow this slipped through the cracks is completely insane to me. It was reported through a safe to telephone call, but by the time they got there, he was already dead. I don't know how he did it. But so that is out of 2 years, we have one kid involved in a homicide. We have 2 kids who have tried to kill themselves, one of them successfully. And we've got a whole bunch of other shit again that I haven't even gotten into. Something is wrong. But this is a small district. This is a small program. And it is so fucked up that they can't do the basic thing that they're supposed to do, which is, well, their jobs, take care of these kids, and not in a way that's inappropriate. I'm the last person or the first person to say, like you, that the government doesn't co-parent, right? But like you said, there is an obligation, there is a responsibility. And I mean, again, full disclosure, me and Seth, we tried to get in, look at like, okay, what classes was he taking? I wanted to know if he had any classes with Karen, because she's up at the fucking high school teaching kids all of last year and this year as well. And I was like, did he
Well, let's
have any
face it,
classes with
if he
her?
felt traumatized by her for those 2 years and then had to even see her,
There were
never
kids,
mind have a
I shit you
class with
not,
her.
who they were, these kids were, I think, joking, being tongue in cheek. But whenever she made, the comment of, whenever there's 8th graders talking about how they're excited to go to the high school, and she's like, I might follow you up there, I might transfer up there. There was multiple kids who said, I will kill myself if I have to have you again as a teacher. And they weren't kidding. They sorry, they were kidding, but the sentiment of that sounds like a nightmare, that they were dead serious about. This kid wasn't one of those kids that I don't remember him saying anything like that. But that kind of speaks to how eager kids were to be done with her, because of how completely unstable she was.
I don't
So
think
all
it
that
can
to
be
say,
over. Sorry.
go ahead, go ahead.
I was
Well,
just gonna
okay, let
say
me
I
finish.
don't
Can I
think.
finish this one
Okay,
thought?
go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I'm
please do.
I'm sick, and I'm sure like my coffee's wearing off, and I'm super scatterbrained. Anyway, but all that to say, the reason why I talked about, why I even brought up Karen, and why I brought up, the system of why how he was pulled back and how it responded, is because a functioning, or a system that functions with the incentives that are geared towards the best interest of kids, this doesn't happen. I'm not saying like about him killing himself. I don't know. Like, there were numerous factors there. I'm not saying that ultimately all of the responsibility and all the blame falls on that last year, the 2019 to 2020 school year. I'm not saying that. And I put that in the letter. However, there's no way that it wasn't a factor in terms of his overall outlook on life and his self-esteem. And we shouldn't even have to be able to ask the question of if the trauma and abuse he experienced at the hands of this teacher was a factor in his suicide, because that shit shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Right.
It should have responded to when people were like, this is fucked up. He shouldn't be in here. He should not be this. None of this makes sense. And it did not work that way. And it will never work that way, at least 99 times out of 100, because of how the incentives are stacked, and how completely, how that system, and that's what I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, is clearly calibrated for something else. It is not calibrated it's not optimized for the well-being of kids. It's optimized for self-preservation. And it's really well optimized for it, by the way. It's extremely well optimized for it, but it's not optimized for the well-being of kids. And so now we're left going, maybe the abuse he experienced was part of the suicide. Maybe it wasn't. Why should I even be asking that? Why should I even be asking that? It's like, yeah, if a kid was molested and then they kill themselves, maybe the molestation had something to do with it. Maybe it didn't. But could we say, at least it's safe to say, that they're probably less likely to kill themselves if they aren't molested? Fucking probably. And I'm not saying that it's the same thing, that it's, one for one what he experienced. I'm just saying that shouldn't even have been a factor in our minds.
No.
Does that make
And
sense?
some people would say, there's an argument to be made that when your wounds are on the inside, and nobody else can see them. I mean, you might have been one of the only people, you and Seth, and a couple of people who were paying attention, who saw that hurt. If you are molested, as horrific as that is, and you can show that, and you have evidence, whatever, like, everyone gets it. Everyone immediately hears, oh, molestation, that's bad, right? But you try to talk about these kinds of subtle forms of abuse and manipulation, and I'm going to move you down
And
from these
harm.
classes, and take away your hope, and take away your self-esteem. That is that slow drip torture, where you just, as you said, he's writing, I'm worthless, what good is it, etc. You take away the person's will to live slowly over time. That might be harder to bounce back from. In fact, I mean, it's not that it's a contest, but I'm just saying, I really don't think, as I was gonna say before when we were like back and forth, I don't think it can be overstated that moving him back into self-contained the way she did was devastating. I think I
Absolutely.
cannot see
It was
how that was
horrible.
not devastating for him.
It was, and I watched him that's why I had taken a picture. Like I said, it's blurry. But I could make out the part on the margins where he's like, it doesn't matter what I do. I know I'm worthless. And I remember, and I could make out part of what he's talking about, like how she still moves me. Cause one of the things is she kept moving him, and she would say, well, I won't move you if you do this. And he would do the thing that she wanted him to do, and she would still move him to a different seat. I mean, it's completely fucked up.
It almost seems sadistic. Like she had something against this kid.
He wasn't, he was not giving her what she wanted emotionally. And that's why, like, I really go back and forth.
That is sick.
It is. It is.
Adults
I
who
go
do
back
that
and
to
forth
children,
with
period. I don't care if they're parents or other adults. If you
totally.
use children that way because there's some gaping hole inside of you, and you use a
She
kid that way, there's a dark place in hell for you.
she had significant emotional issues, as I mentioned in previous conversations. And at the end of the day, I go, okay, am I mad at her, or am I mad at the system that put her in charge of kids? I'm a lot more mad at that than because it's just harder to be upset at a person that you go, there's clearly something wrong with you. There's clearly, I mean, she was on prescription medicine for things like anxiety. And I think she probably had some form of bipolar or manic, because she would have these episodes where she'd be super high sometimes and super low. I'm not qualified to diagnose. I'm just saying she had the patterns that you would see whenever it comes to those things. And I know that she took prescription medicine for different mental health reasons. And that's not to say that, by the way, if you do that, that's kind of a sign that it seems like you might be getting some kind of help, right? And I don't want to stigmatize and say no one who is on prescription medicine for mental stuff should be a teacher. I take ADHD medicine, right? So like, and not that those are necessarily the same thing, but the point remains. I'm saying that she clearly wasn't getting sufficient help for her issues. And I'm much more, again, it's like, if you, who are you mad at? Are you mad at the person who has chemical imbalances and things that are wrong with them on a really deep level? I mean, a lot of her stuff stems back to her father. She would talk about this. She would overshare, like, in ways that were totally inappropriate. And she had really deep issues. Her poor husband, we had a staff Christmas party, and me and Seth ended up playing pool with him, and he was a great guy. And we're like, this poor bastard, and her kids were on IEPs, and she felt like a mom that she was failing as a mom. And so she wanted to at least feel like she was succeeding as a mom to these kids. There's a lot of stuff there. And it's like, okay, who am I mad at? The person who has all these issues in their life internally and externally is just a total dumpster fire, or the system that goes, that person should be in charge. The whole way you mentioned earlier, like how incentives, the whole way she even wound up being the tier 1 person is the I love my job, I love my kids person. And her cooked up this thing, where she just wasn't feeling satisfied with doing English, doing special ed English. And so that she should, because she had a SPED degree, that somehow that made her qualified to do behavior support. And they didn't talk to Seth about it, who is a person who is one of the people in charge of the behavior support program. They brought the idea to the principal, and the principal said, sounds good. That's how that happened. Like, it wasn't any type of, there was no rigor or logic or anything that went into it. It was just, she could give a spirited argument, for why she wanted to do it. And they did it. I mean, it is really just that completely arbitrary.
Can I be mad at both?
Yeah, you
I
can't be
mean,
mad at both. But I'm saying I'm more mad at the system that's like,
yeah, no,
yeah,
obviously
let's put the
that
blind person in the pilot seat.
no, I agree. I agree. But but also the blind person has, I think, a responsibility to say, "Hey, by the way,
Totally.
guys, I'm blind. I can't fly the plane." So, I mean,
What you're not going to do if you're insecure and you are constantly looking for validation. I mean, this is a
yeah,
person who complained every month because she thought she should get teacher of the month. And so she was like, why didn't I get teacher of the, like, I mean, this is a person who is so remarkably insecure. And so that's where it was so sick, because it's like, she did not have the confidence to say, like, it takes confidence to say, to know your limitations, know what you can and can't do. And she didn't have the ability to do that. She just didn't. And there was a few times where, and I use the term lucidity very intentionally, where she did articulate that. There was a one specific conversation I had with her during that 19 to 20 school year where I'm like,
yeah,
holy shit. It reminded me of, so my mom has bipolar schizophrenia. And there's only one time that I've ever had a conversation with my mom where she expressed some kind of self-awareness of the collateral damage, the emotional collateral damage that she has done to people in her family. And I remember where I was. I was like walking through Walmart and I'm like, holy shit, where did this person come from? Like, my mom gets it. Like, oh my gosh, it's the only time we ever had a conversation like that. But it sticks with you because you're like, light bulb. You know, is this permanent?
right,
That conversation I had with Karen where she was like, where I told her, you can get fulfillment out of your job, but you can't get your purpose. You can't get your identity out of your job. If your identity is based on how like emotionally unstable kids feel about you on a day-to-day
yeah,
basis,
yeah,
you are going to be in constant turmoil. And she's like, you're right. That makes perfect sense. I've been trying to get my identity and my self-perception from how these kids view me. Like, you're totally right. And I'm like, she gets it. And it's there and then it's gone. Right. So she did have those moments. And there's a few other times where she would kind of express doubt. And then it'd be like, you tell me if I was doing something wrong, right? And it's like, I will say yes, but obviously not. Like, you know what I mean? And so, anyway, but to your point of like, yeah, there is culpability. Of course there is. She's an adult. But that insecurity prevented her from having the self-awareness, at least with any type of like meaning behind it, to say,
right.
I can't do this. And then whenever she did do it, it was, you know, this kind of, it wasn't in the middle of the year. It was at the end of that 2019-2020 school year where she transfers up to the high school and has
Right.
this big send off, you know, and she was very calculated about how she worded. It wasn't, I can't cut it anymore. It was some other nonsense.
Now, not to derail us from this specific topic, but how concerned are you with the fact that the American Psychological Association and also the Academy of Pediatrics have bought into the equity stuff and the intent over impact mantra and all of that, because obviously everything I'm hearing you say sounds like it will be ill served by the ideology that is infecting our schools in terms of
Sure.
psychology and what they're the crap they're selling, the snake oil they're selling about what builds self-esteem and what makes kids do well in school, is going to be particularly harmful in my opinion. I'm no expert, but on these kids. This
Sure.
cohort of kids are the most vulnerable to this kind of stuff.
Totally.
And if this is
What,
going on before that really seeps in, I don't even want to think about what's going to happen to kids like Sunny when they're faced with this stuff.
here's what I'll say. And I'd like to, you know, I'll kind of respond, and then I'd like to read that and talk about the practical response to
Yeah, let's
what
do
Seth
that.
and I are doing. Um, But to kind of flush out what I talked about earlier about how our institutions are optimized, what I'd say is I conceptualize, let's just take a few threads here. Okay. So the pediatric, was it the American Pediatrics
Yeah, I think it's the
Association?
Academy of Pediatrics and also the
Academy,
American
yeah.
Psychological Association.
Let's just go
Yeah.
with the pediatrics. So let's just pick three different things. Um, you know, they scrub an article that talks about the importance of seeing faces. And then shortly after is when they release this whole thread about why it's okay for kids to wear masks and how there's no data showing that masks are harmful, right? which is, of course, again, ludicrous. Why would we have that? Why would we've never done a study, about what happens if you feed kids nothing but Cheetos, for 9 months, because it's like, we know, like, we don't need a double blind study to say what happens, anyway. So let's take that from the I think it is the American Association of Pediatrics, something like that. And then let's go with the APA, which is the accrediting institution for every psychologist. They come up with the standards, as you know, and your audience probably knows, saying they release their, kind of, I pledge allegiance, to the woke, what I call far left orthodoxy, but to this progressive ideology. They're talking about the race stuff specifically, in that statement, but it's going to incorporate all this stuff. And which, by the way, that institution has been corrupted for a long time. I mean, if you look at, especially in West Coast, like psychologist circles, for a long time, it's been, how do we incorporate our activism into our practice? Obviously, that's with like private practice psychologists, but obviously that's also part of the mental health professionals that are getting accredited. So that's where they've clearly become compromised in a way.
Right.
And then we could also take something like the CDC releasing a tweet. I'm not making this about COVID, but I'm just giving 3 different things of why you should still wear a mask even if you're vaccinated. And there's no conversation about like natural immunity or things like that.
Right.
So something's clearly wrong with these institutions. And so my point that I'm trying to make is, you ask, like, am I worried about the APA or the pediatrics or any of those things? I'm worried about them. Like, none of those recent revelations are changed my math in terms of how I viewed them. Brett Weinstein had this great quote a couple of years ago when he's talking about this kind of ideology, and he said, "We don't know where this thing isn't." And so I've kind of
right.
just, been operating with that. And what I would say is, and this is kind of a recent revelation that I had, and I'll just share it with your audience, is, and I made a thread about this on Twitter, and anyway, is that we need to stop conceptualizing these institutions as broken. They're not broken. They're not. They're only broken by our standards and our assessment of what we think they should do, or maybe what they say they're doing. I was talking to a person who is kind of big in the space about this thing, and they said, "Well, I like to use the term failed." And I said, honestly, the more I think about it, I'm not even sure that is the right term, because do you think that our corporate press and big tech looks at the outcome of the 2020 election and considers themselves a failure? Like, do you think that they think that they're failing? Or do you think that they think that they're actually doing exactly what they want to do? Like, in other words, is the outcomes of their institution a mistake, or is it intentional?
Right.
If it's intentional, then we have to stop saying that and if it's intentionally inconsistent, we can't say it's broken. We can't say it's failing. And this person said, "Yeah, actually, you're right. We should say they're hijacked." I said, "Exactly." And so I made this thread about it. And the way that I framed it, and why this is important, is, and I promise this gets to your question, was I said, okay, so, let's take the idea that they're broken, that these institutions are broken, whether it's the APA, education, the Department of Education, or the CDC, or whatever. Let's take the notion that they're broken. So during World War II, we converted the entire economy to a war economy, and there were some manufacturing companies that switched their production from one thing to another. We actually saw this under COVID, where MyPillow goes to making masks, for example. It's a Defense Production Act, although Trump didn't actually use it. Anyway, so one of those was Singer sewing machines. So Singer sewing machines actually stops making sewing machines, and a lot of their plants start making Colt 45s. You can actually find Colt 45s that have the Singer name on that. It's like it's the name of a sewing machine that's on the side of a 45 caliber pistol. So you're a worker at a Singer factory, and for some reason you don't know, you haven't been at work for a while, you don't know that production switched over. You show up to work, and no one briefs or anything. It's loud in there, and you see that all of the conveyor belts are not putting together sewing machines anymore.
Right.
They're putting together these Colt 45s. Right. Nothing is coming off of these conveyor belts but Colt 45s, and you watch for hours, and you're just mesmerized. It's not poorly assembled sewing machines. It's not just random hunks of metal. It's the same product put together with extreme quality and consistency.
Right.
Would you think that your factory machines were broken? No.
Right.
No. You would be able to ascertain by looking at what they were producing that they had become optimized for a different thing, right?
Right.
And actually, if you had never worked there and you never knew it was a sewing machine factory, you would go, oh, this is a Colt 45 factory. I don't have any preconceived notions about what this thing is supposed to produce. And so I'm just going to look at what it's making and assume that this is what it is supposed to do. So my point is that whenever you conceptualize an institution as broken, you see it as a mistake, as a problem to be fixed, as a product of incompetence. And actually, even the name of this, I know I came up with the name of this, of the high cost of incompetence. That this is the way these institutions are functioning is not a product of incompetence. It's a product of evolutionary forces that select certain attributes and make the system highly optimized for a different thing than we thought it was supposed to be producing or manufacturing or whatever. And so my point is that if you think of a building as broken, like I said, it seems like an accident. It seems like, stupidity. And the way you conceptualize a building that is broken and dilapidated versus a building that is filled with heavily armed and hostile militiamen is very different. These institutions are not broken. They have been hijacked and they have become optimized for a different thing.
Right.
So if we want to understand what they've become optimized for, we have to look at what they're producing, what's coming off the conveyor belt. It's not sewing machines anymore. It's something else. A machine that makes the same thing with a high degree of consistency, little variability, no deviation really, is a really well-oiled machine. These institutions have become optimized for a lot of things. People can speculate all they want. Just look at what they're producing. I would say one of the main things is just self-preservation, self-legitimization, and the support and enabling of a certain type of power structure. That's what they become optimized for. If you look at them through that lens, you go, actually, these things function really well. Over our conversations where I've talked about how completely fucked my school district is in a conservative area and how many numerous cases between Seth, who started this process back in 2012, right? And under a different administration, school administration with different lawyers, was literally told at one point by the school's lawyers that it was perfectly acceptable for the superintendent to investigate himself. Like, let that sink in. That's how that system was. And the lawyer could say with a straight face, because there's no one to stop it. There's no one to say, like, that's completely insane, because it's actually kind of true. So these things function really well for self-preservation. They function really well for circling the wagons around the people at the top. If the people at the top support the power structure or towing the proper ideological line.
Right.
So that's a long way of answering your question. I think it's important because, for the same reason I was talking to that person about why I think it's important, is because if people conceptualize these institutions as broken, they're thinking about them the wrong way.
Right.
You go to repair a thing that's broken, a thing that's been hijacked and has you completely outnumbered, completely outmaneuvered, completely out from a strategic standpoint, has all of the advantages.
Right.
You don't go to repair that. You don't take that back over. You go and you either bomb the shit out of it if you can, or you let it collapse on itself. Or ideally, you build your own thing and get strong, and then you can take it over, or you just supplant it whenever, because it's incompetent at the thing that people think it should be doing.
Right.
It collapses. My point is that the APA is only going to produce crazy bullshit. So just because we have a good example of them tweeting out crazy bullshit lately, it's like, okay, well, was the day before that the APA really well functioned or well optimized for the things it was previously supposed to be doing? Of course not. Was the CDC I thought it was, but it's pretty obvious that it's not. Was the American Association of Pediatrics? I thought it was, but it's clearly not. And so we have to think about it as like, okay, yeah, I'm not surprised the APA did that. What we need to be we can spend a lot. Curtis Yarvin says this, and I think it's really smart, and I'll end it here. Is he says we can spend all of our time trying to find the wires and connect the dots to how all these things are in cahoots, or we can go, okay, how did it get like this? And how do we make it to where we don't have to operate under the umbrella of this thing anymore? That's a
and
much
even the how did it get like this is only really interesting insofar as we need to understand what this is. We need to define what this is. So
and
you
how to
define
keep it from happening in whatever we build.
well,
Next.
correct. And the thing is, you looked at this at the sewing machine factory and you realized this is no longer a sewing machine factory. It is now a Colt 45 factory. Okay. Well, what I struggle with for my audience and for parents that I deal with is communicating to them that the factory is not making sewing machines anymore. That the thing that they look at and they say, you're making guns in the factory. You're making guns in the factory. No, we're not. No. We're making sewing machines. Look at this pretty sewing machine. Doesn't it look like a sewing machine? It's a sewing machine.
It's magnificent.
That is clearly a gun. No. It's a sewing machine. And there are still parents.
And you're not qualified to tell me if it's a gun or a sewing machine.
You're not qualified to tell me this isn't a sewing machine. Have you ever sewn before? And then the parents
Can you explain a sewing machine? Yeah.
Right. The parents tragically will say to me, well, they tell me it's not there. Or I looked at the documents and they told me that the thing I was looking at wasn't really the thing that you said it was. It's this other thing. And my heart breaks because I think there's a couple things in play. Well, first of all, some people are just susceptible to being lied to, and they just believe what they're told by experts with fancy titles and so forth. And then I think there are other people who are in a strange phase of mourning. In other words, it's like when you have a relationship with somebody who's toxic. But they didn't always seem toxic. When you first met them, they were love bombing you.
They weren't irredeemably toxic. There were positive attributes.
Yeah, there were positive attributes. So you saw the positive attributes and you saw what they promised you, and they were going to be like your knight in shining armor or your princess in the castle, whatever. And then afterwards, you got your hopes all up. This is great. Maybe you order your whole life around them. You arrange where you're going to live, what you're going to do for a living, how many kids you even have around the promise of this wonderful person or entity. And then, they start, the sort of bloom comes off the rose, the mask drops, the reality starts to set in. You have to go first you have to actually face it and stop being in denial. And then you have to grieve. Sure. And what I seem to encounter are a lot of people who are stuck somewhere between denial and whatever the next phase is where you have to go through the grieving process. They don't want to let go. They'll say, yeah, I know it's terrible, but I can't leave. I know it's awful and my kid is not getting with it, but I can't leave.
Why do women stay with abusive boyfriends? You don't get it. My CDs are in his truck. Like it's always some stupid ass.
Right. And I don't mean to minimize this. These are people's children, right? But it's really important for people to recognize the factory's not making sewing machines anymore, and they haven't been for a very long time. And when they tell you this is a sewing machine, you need to accept that it's not a sewing machine.
And trust your instincts. I think what I would add, if there was one thing that I would encourage people to do, is to, as best as you can, and it's really hard, by the way, I acknowledge this is really hard, is try to start toying with the mental experiment of pretending you know nothing about what these institutions are supposed to be doing.
Yes.
It's really hard, but try to pretend you know nothing about it, and then look at them and pretend you've been tasked with figuring out what they do, and take just a little bit of time to look at what is the fruit of that institution. What is it creating? And use that to go back and recalibrate your expectations and your assumptions and just your fundamental like foundational knowledge of how you think about that institution. It's really hard, especially for something like education or like a school, especially if you've been in that community your whole life or something. I get that. But I'm saying if you do the thing, I mean, this is a really old principle, right? Like Jesus is like, you'll know them by their fruits. A good tree does not produce bad fruit. A bad tree does not produce good fruit. You'll know it by its fruits. And so it's like, if you can just indulge me in that experiment and say, I'm going to try to forget everything I know about this thing and look at what it's doing. What are the outcomes that it's producing with my kids or this community or like academically or anything like that? And just assume that I don't have any like expectations of this. I'm just trying to figure out what it does and then try to figure out how good it is at what it does. You might go at the end of it, you might go, okay, I think it seems like this is some kind of institution for learning. That's what it would say it is, but it doesn't seem very good at doing the learning thing. So it's got to be doing something else first and foremost. Okay, what's up with all these school board meetings? Well, it seems really good at defending itself. It seems really good at arguing for its own legitimacy. So maybe that's actually what it's calibrated for.
Right.
Maybe this thing has actually been optimized, and the point is that they hyperreal strawberry. There's a nice vocal distance, but
Yeah. I think
Baudrillard
it's great.
reference.
It's a great reference.
And so maybe if I say their first and foremost thing that they're clearly doing is self-preservation, and this kind of education thing is just like, if it happens, it happens, but it's only going to happen to the degree that it doesn't conflict with this other thing, then maybe I shouldn't look like, if I went to a McDonald's or, any restaurant and the food was fucking terrible, and every time I complained about the food, the waiters and the cooks heckled me out of the place, like, I would be like, well, I mean, they say they're a restaurant, but it seems like they're just a place that's really good at shutting down criticism. I'm probably not going to go there for food anymore. Like, if I want to learn about self-preservation tactics, I might go there. But like, my expectation of this place is not good food for sure.
Well, and it's
you know what I mean?
It's a step worse than that too, because it's the McDonald's where they've already taken the money from you. Some guys with guns came
Totally.
Figuratively. They took
You'll
the money.
enjoy this Big Mac, you piece of shit.
Yeah, they've taken the money to tell you, because everyone needs to eat, we will provide the food. So we're taking the money. Here's your place to go for the food. This is the McDonald's you've been assigned to. It's in your zip code. Okay. And now you show up and you don't get to order, and you don't get to say, you don't get any say at all in what they serve you for the food they say they're going to give you because you need to eat. You have a right to eat. So we've taken the money and here's the food. And they give you a brown paper bag and they go, here's your food. And you open it up and you go, yeah, I see a couple plastic toys, a cold French fry, and a packet of ketchup, right? It's like a grab bag. And maybe, so you go, you move your house. So that now your McDonald's is in a supposedly nicer part of town. Oh, yay. You get half a package of French fries. They're still cold, but whatever. My point is, in what other realm of your life do they take money from you and then it's a grab bag of what you get? You have no idea what you're going to get. They tell you it's this essential need. Society has an interest in you receiving this thing that we have taken money from you to pay for. Here's your grab bag. Don't you dare complain about what's inside of it. Meanwhile, what's inside of it is the future of your child. That's what's inside the grab bag. And yet parents go, give me my bag. Give me my bag. I already paid for it. I want my bag. And I'm like, it's still cold French fries. But this one is another one that's good. This Aldous Huxley, they are normal not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society.
Sure.
The perfect adjustment to that abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. And that kind of speaks to what you're talking about of this whole thing. I know you wanted to talk about the letter though, or do you still have time to read the letter that you're going to send?
Totally. Yeah. What I will say is, just to piggyback off that quote, is that I can't remember whose original quote this is, but it's something along the lines of the most reasonable thing a person can do is conform to society.
Right.
Therefore, all change only happens because of unreasonable people. But it actually is. if you wanted someone, I mean, just think about this. If you wanted someone to succeed in this milieu of where we're at culturally and societally, you would say, go to public school, soak up every single thing you learn, go to college, probably get a degree in some kind of social science, go and get a job at the diversity, equity, inclusion department of some business, right? If you wanted someone to, like, you will socially, you're going to have friends, you're guaranteed to get a job, and you're going to probably be one of the most powerful people at the place you work. You're going to be completely in lockstep with the societal, like the prevailing orthodoxy and narratives. That is a recipe for a life of comfort in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that mentally it's comfortable to do this stuff, but that is a lot more comfortable than telling someone everything is fucked.
Than being me.
Right. Now, my argument is, and actually, Carlin and I were talking about this in our last episode of our podcast that I haven't put out yet, but is that I have found a certain degree of freedom on the other side of that black pill, because whenever you realize how unsalvageable all these institutions are, it frees you up to stop trying to salvage them. It frees you up to stop spinning your wheels on something that is ultimately a completely fruitless task, and to go, oh, like, I don't have to worry about trying to do this thing that I'm probably completely incapable of doing. There are people who are going to try to do that. And by the way, if they succeed, more power to them. They probably won't, but I'm not called to that. I don't have a lot of hope for that. And so I can start thinking outside the box of, okay, what can I do that would be a productive use of my time? Like you were talking about convincing parents and convincing people of this. One of the things I mentioned to Carlin in that conversation was, I'm increasingly convinced that any strategy that depends on convincing people of our perspective, or that depends on building some kind of coalition, like intentionally, as opposed to just being something that is welcoming to people that are casualties of the system. Those are two different things.
Yes, exactly.
If your entire system is like pass fail based on how many people I convince, it's like, no, that is no. You're convincing people to make a decision.
Salvaged.
Right. You're asking people to do something that is not only not fair, it is the most ridiculous thing to ask someone. That's why, like, I don't call it red pilling, it's red peeling. There's a process of learning how completely, like, bad things really are, right, with all these institutions. You don't go from, man, I'm not sure CNN's telling me the truth, and maybe NPR isn't as unbiased as I thought, to, holy shit, the CDC's lost, abolish public schools. Like, that's a process. It's a right, like peeling an onion.
You also have to give people a life raft. They have to have somewhere to go.
Be a life raft. Be the thing. I say you want to be a thing that is a huge parachute underneath the burning building to catch people as they jump out. You want to be able to, with open arms, catch all the casualties. But if your program is designed on intentionally trying to convince people that are in that thing and aren't don't see anything wrong with it, then you're wasting your time. Anyway, but all that to say, and I know that we are in total agreement on this, is that it's like, that's why I don't worry about like the AP or these other things. Like, one of my biggest concerns is we do need new credentialing institutions. Like, we're not going to be able to build new institutions without an accreditation system that will accredit them. But we need them in order to have new institutions for credentialing, the kind of the building block occupations of society, like competent, bioengineers and chemists and neurosurgeons and stuff. But that's a whole nother thing. But the point is that people can't look at like these things as savable. Like, they're just not. It's like, oh, the APA did this, tweeted this thing out. It's like, you'll probably, like, okay, like, and like
I like what Peter said of like, where isn't this stuff?
Yeah. That's a Brett Weinstein. Yeah. It's a Brett Weinstein.
Oh, it's Brett Weinstein. Sorry.
This thing isn't. Yeah. Yeah. No, Pete's is the universal solvent, which I think is
that's it.
The best
I get them
two-word summary And no, yeah, it's the best summary. I think the shortest, briefest summary of this ideology in existence that I've heard.
Yeah,
Universal solvent. Like,
it is.
doesn't get much simpler than that. So
Nope.
to the letter that I want to read. So this is something where so me and Seth, I wrote this, and then he came over today and I read it, and he was like, gave me some tips, and also gave me, and I wanted to, can I briefly talk to you about just the system that we have for checking on these kids before I get to
but whatever we need to know, like whatever context we need, tell us.
So because I kind of want to end with the letter, but so to give another example of just how completely retooled for something else than that our the education system is,
not sewing machines
in my district. Yeah, they aren't making sewing machines.
No.
That's for damn sure. So Seth gets, basically he has to apply for what is already his job description at the end of this last year, and he goes through this process. Once again, the superintendent lies and is just a total scumbag, man. This guy is a consummate politician. And he's actually really disarming. You wouldn't think that he was like this, but he totally is. So he ends up, they send him to work at this administration building where there's basically nothing for Seth to do. They give him some like vague description of one of the things they want him to do is kind of be in charge of our email and web search and safe to tell monitoring system. So what those are, so safe to tell is a thing where there's there's a number of people can call anonymously to say, hey, I think so-and-so is going to harm themselves or something like that. That's actually how, whenever Sonny was found, someone called the safe to tell and said, I think, he's right at risk. And so they sent the police out, and it already happened. But we also had things for doing that monitored web searches on school computers and email exchanges for certain keywords and stuff. So a few years ago, so I'm going to describe the system that this is what Seth got handed, and how he was just like, holy shit. He was telling me about this today. I'm like, oh my God. I knew part of it, but I didn't know all of it. So they didn't have like an actual plan of what to do for like the web search and email monitoring. So they just bought like 2 different software programs, one of them for email, one of them for web search monitoring. Right. And so you should probably get one program that does both. But anyway, and so they get this because it was just kind of bought and installed by our tech department. What ends up happening is our tech department is the one getting the alerts from the tech department, not anyone with any mental health training. Our tech department is getting the alerts from these email and web search things for kids that could be like risky stuff. Okay. This is 2 years, or I think what Seth said was a 2 years minimum. Our tech department then is forwarding those on to our special ed director, because our special ed director went to school buildings and was like, first was trying to go, and to his credit, our special ed director is a spineless bastard, but and who's just basically the whipping boy of the superintendent. This special ed director has numerous times said, I can't get school buildings to follow the law. I can't get principals to do these things. Like I can't, because he's completely feckless. Anyway, so he goes, to his credit, to try and get counselors to set up with these buildings of, okay, who's going to receive the alerts for kids in these systems? And the counselors tell him no. They're like, we're not going to do this. So then he goes to principals, and one principal complains and says, this is going to overwhelm us. We don't want to do this. Guess which principal it was, by the way? The one at the middle school, that piece of shit. And so the special ed director says, okay, I'll do it. So he's the one getting forwarded all of these alerts. And what he doesn't know is he's like, after a while, he's getting like 3 a week on average, something like that. And he's like, this is too much to handle. I don't want to deal with like forwarding these to the building. So then he puts a secretary in charge of it. And so when Seth comes in, that's one of the things they tell him, like, okay, you're going to be in charge of, you're going to be responsible for this thing. And so Seth does the systems analysis, and he's like, okay, why is the secretary? So the tech guys are getting this, and then it's going to you or the secretary, and then the secretary is forwarding it on. Like, what if these are urgent? So then what Seth finds out is the tech guys they're actually getting 15 to 20 of these on average, but then they're filtering and deciding which ones are like worthy of attention and which ones aren't.
The tech
So
people.
yes. And by the way, like, I can understand how in some of the cases it's like, okay, a kid forwards a dirty joke to another kid via email. They can look at that and go,
Oh,
sure.
okay. But
But
still.
you do not want to be in the position where you are filtering it, because what if you make a bad call and a kid hurts themselves or another kid, right? So for 2 years, somewhere around there, the tech guys are filtering these damn things to the sped director. He has no idea. And or somewhere in there, he's like, okay, just send it to my secretary. And then she sent him to the building. It's like, does that sound like a system that even makes sense for dealing with something as urgent as like maybe a web search of like how to, blow up my building or something? You know what I mean? Or ways to effective ways to commit suicide. I don't know. Like, or sexual harassment, or sending an email to a kid like, I'm going to fuck you up, or I'm going to fucking kill you during second period. Does that sound like an efficient thing? It needs to go directly to these buildings. So Seth is like, this needs to go to like, this is crazy. This should not go even to me. I don't want to be in charge of this. If people want to forward it, that's fine. But what needs to happen is and he ends up, it's like, I'm serious, Deb, a couple months of resistance. He's able to figure this out within 3 days. This has been going on for a couple of years. He figures this out in 3 days. And he says, okay, the email, the alert system, the one that checks emails for keywords, doesn't even have a thing in it to alert buildings directly. It will only go to these tech guys. So why don't we upgrade to the system we have for web searches has one for emails? And by the way, they have live support that will look at these things and will send them directly to the buildings. Oh, and by the way, if there is a serious thing, they have a phone chain where they will call you. And these are professionals who will do all the filtering for you. So either this all needs to be forwarded to these buildings and then they can deal with it, which that's a whole nother issue. And it shouldn't be forwarded to 8 people, because then they're all going to go, well, I assume so. And person 2 is going to take care of it. And person 2 assumes person 3, so on and so forth, bystander effect. And so it takes him, I think, about a week or so. So it takes him 3 days to figure out, holy shit, this is completely insane. This is so inefficient. Like, what happens if a kid says, I'm going to do this thing during first period? The emails go to these people and they're doing this thing, and we don't get any of it figured. Or what happens if it goes to someone at 1 a.m, right? Like, he's like, this is crazy. So now he was able to talk them into, but it was like pulling teeth. And so they're trying out this system to where it's live monitoring, and there are people who are actually doing this, and it's going on. But then he gets tasked with, okay, you need to go work with buildings to help them come up with a system of what to do with once they get the emails that are actually sent to them.
Sure.
And he's like, okay, I shouldn't, like, once we've established who's going to get it, we should trust them with those things. Like, I don't need to do that, but he gets told you have to do that. So he's already getting pushback from counselors who are like, well, we can handle this thing, because this is what always happens with him is they'll tell him to go do this thing, but then he's not given any teeth or any support from the administration to like actually go and do these things. So
You would think before they set up a system like this, they would come up with the protocols for actually responding to the system.
I don't know. Anyway, at least
call me crazy. Like, why?
Maybe. At least they have something now that where it's
yeah.
In all fairness, this is better than what it was.
But if I'm going to put something in the hands of kids and say, or people, and say, like, here's what you use to report things safely, that would be like saying we have 911, but we haven't quite figured out who the operators are going to be.
Sure. Well, at least, I mean, in all fairness, though, at least this is a more efficient way of getting them that. Like, they already didn't have a method of what to do whenever they got these emails, but the method for getting them these emails was extremely truncated and ridiculous and not efficient. And especially if there was an urgency, it was not well tuned for that. So at least they solved that issue.
Best place for this, Truman? I mean, I've been asking this for months. Is the school the best place to be the center of all things related to mental health when it comes to minor children. And the reason I'm asking that is I know you have to do it the whole by law thing when it's the hours between 8 and 3 or whatever it is. But I'm noticing a lot of these safe to tell or these stop apps, these different apps that have to do with this. And I think that we're adding to this, as you already put out, gun factory. We're adding responsibilities. They've not proven to be good at doing the stuff they were already tasked with. And now I'm seeing them saying, no, this is going to be the center of all mental health care for children.
In all honesty, the way I would answer that is by just proposing an alternative, which is, think about like what Scott Adams says. It's better to try something and do it poorly than to just like not actually try to do something at all.
So like 911 wouldn't be an option or
No.
anything.
What I'm saying is, so here's the alternative. So if we were to say, if I have to pick between two scenarios, maybe it's a false binary, but I'm saying there's a kid who has a bad home life. His parents are kind of derelict. And, he's exhibited like at-risk behavior. Do I want there to be a system in place where the school, if that kid searches on his school laptop for certain terms or emails using his school email certain terms, that the adults get alerted to that versus no one gets alerted to that?
I see your point.
Like, I would much rather, even if those people are not super good at their job, it's probably most times going to be better than no one being alerted to it. So like in all honesty, if I have to pick between those two things, like, I'm going to pick this scenario where people are alerted to it. Even if they're not super efficient at doing it, it's in a lot of cases, it's better than nothing, in my personal opinion.
Better than nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that puts it in context. I'm seeing them opening up like mental health care centers, like for everything inside the school. And that makes me nervous.
Yeah. And that's fair. I think that, to the, just an example to go back to the SEL thing, right? Like, and I got into this, I was talking to someone, one of my followers on Twitter, and we were talking about it. And eventually we got to where they were like, well, I'm talking about doing this in regular ed classes with kids who, this isn't part. And I'm like, oh, well, holy shit. Yeah, no, that's totally different. If there's a kid who like, and part of my, bias and my experience in education is that I have worked with competent people. I see myself as a competent person. Sure. And so I've worked with people like Seth, who it's like, I've seen these things, and there's another psychologist who I worked with who is competent. She was just a political coward, and wouldn't speak up about this stuff because she wanted to run for office here as a Democrat, which wasn't going to happen. She's lost the 2 times she's ran. Anyway, doesn't matter. Right. But she was competent in her job. Like, she understood this stuff really well. That other teacher who was the tier 2 one, I think I called her Dolores, who ultimately also caved to the incentives of the system. Like, was good at her job in a lot of ways, and in terms of running behavior plans and so on and so forth. And so it's like, I know that not all of these things are pathological, and that not all of them are done by people that are just completely incompetent activist dipshits. Like, I know that because I've seen that. So yeah, like to the point I was saying about the SEL thing, it's like, I've seen where appropriate, if a kid is on a BIP and we have a circle group and it's facilitated by the school psychologist, and he has a very specific thing he's doing, or maybe he's facilitating a restorative justice circle that we've worked through and talked about, like, it under the right circumstances, as in done properly, the way they're intended, those are good things.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean,
whenever they try to universalize these things, and make it like, well, we should do this with all these kids. And, there are some kids that might have certain sexual deviancy or certain issues. And so we just need to do this with all these kids, and let's have books with masturbation and pornographic images. Like, that's where it's taken it too far, where again, universal solvent, right? Just think universal solvent. But the idea that there's no place for this stuff in a well-functioning as per like what it was originally designed for, school, I think is completely
Right.
ridiculous. It's that it's the factory that's become optimized for a different thing. But,
Right. Right. No,
there are still people
I
within that
agree.
who are like
Yeah.
building those sewing machines and trying their damnedest to do it.
No,
They're just,
I agree with that,
they're a
and
minority.
there are definitely scenarios where, that, especially when you have people with clinical expertise, where,
Sure.
it can be the difference between, I mean, in the opposite direction, the difference between life and death for a kid.
Yep.
So I see that. I'm just saying, I was talking more about making it universal, like when they're trying to
Yeah.
take this and
Which is ridiculous.
broaden it out across everything. So yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah, I do.
And it speaks to, by the way, you were talking about just the way that you were treated whenever you were working there, and what the incentives were for. It speaks to
Right.
how this system has become optimized for paternalistic personalities.
More like
And it's,
maternalistic.
well, sure. I'm just thinking
Yeah.
about like
Oh, yeah, yeah,
paternalism at a state level. Like,
yeah, that's
about, if we
true.
think about how the left views the role of the state, is very paternalistic mentality. And
Mhm.
so that same mentality, I think, is applied in. But if you were to say what form of, it's absolutely maternalistic. Yes, it's absolutely. I mean, Christina Hoff Sommers writes about this in The War on Boys. And shit, what that book is like 2 decades old, right? And so it's like, yeah, the education system is absolutely built for female learning, female personalities, all that stuff. But it's become optimized for that type of personality, and it's become optimized for like this top-down institutional perspective where, okay, this worked here, or this is a good thing here, let's do it everywhere. This is a good thing here, let's do it everywhere. And so we're just going to do this all across the board and just flatten it out to where everyone's the same, needs the same things, and so on and so forth. That's where they're getting rid of the gifted, and talented programs in these schools
Sure.
as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so can I read this letter?
Yes, please do. So this, if you're joining us late, the letter he's gonna read, this is to the newspaper and to the school, or
Specifically, by the way, if I move to a different tab, you can still see me, right? My camera's still on. Is
I
that
think
right?
so. Yeah,
Well, can you see me right now?
I can
Because I'm
see
in a
you.
different tab. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I can see you.
So this this letter is, in some ways, to be honest, is a form of catharsis for me, to just get it out there and be like, the system failed this kid. I witnessed it firsthand. Um, Not just this kid, the kid who tried to take his own life, and so many of these other kids. Again, not getting into the details, but lots of other instances. And so these are just obviously some of the more glaring. And so this letter, almost this one verbatim, is what's going to go to the newspaper, Laramie Boomerang, and then I'm going to add. Seth gave me some really good, like, he's like, you need to include some of these district policies that they violated by ignoring our complaints, and a few of these other things. And so there's a few other names that I'm going to name specifically,
Right.
that are going to be in the one that goes to the school board as
Okay.
well. And I'm going to send it to a few other people that are just kind of active in the community, to be like, you need to get this out here. And it's just my way of saying, like, I just need to have, like, I spent so much time in the system not having my voice heard in terms of trying to advocate for these kids. All of this always boiled down to trying to advocate for these kids and saying, we have one fucking job, one job, one job. That is to do our best to take care of the kids in our care within the legal and ethical frameworks that we've agreed to. Right. That's it.
Right.
And so, and that was the thing where even just like my union lawyer was like, okay, it's cool, you want to do this for these kids, but I'm not here to represent you as an advocate for the kids. Like, I mean, the whole thing is screwed. I don't want to go down that road. But that's what this letter is to try and get some eyeballs on, because a lot of the people don't know about what took place in that program. A lot of the people
Mhm.
don't know about how bad it is. And it's not popular. It's not a sexy issue. It's not CRT. I mentioned this in the previous conversation with you. People want boogeyman. They want the Trunch Bowl. It's
Mhm.
like, they want to hear stories. They don't want to, but I'm saying, like, in terms of the things that get their attention, it's like, oh, is someone like harassing kids? Like, or is there sexual harassment or something like that? It's not, oh, this person is running plans and or isn't running plans, or is doing this, or they didn't follow the data. Like, that's just not sexy, and a lot of it goes to,
Right.
one of the things Seth was talking to me about today is he's like, I he's dealing with a whole, like, his complaints he's still filing with the district. He's like, I get one sentence or two sentences that are just completely nonsense. He's like, and I have to write 10 pages to refute it. And that's Brandolini's law that we're always up against with any of these issues. For those who don't know, Brandolini's law is that for every piece of bullshit, it takes an order of magnitude amount of truth to debunk it. So if you have a sentence of bullshit, I need a paragraph. If you have a paragraph, I need a chapter. If you have a chapter, I need a book. If you have a book, I need a volume of books, and so on and so forth. And we see this, by the way, people can look at this in society if they're talking about anything. COVID's a good one. CRT is another good one. It takes Nicole Hannah-Jones just saying, you don't want to teach history, or you don't want to teach about the legacy of racism. How long does it take to debunk that? And to get into the specifics, it takes a long time. So my point is that this is me just trying to get some eyeballs on what was going on, and for people to know, and what I get into in the letter is this is indicative of a system that is not working based on what it says it's supposed to be doing. And that ultimately teachers like this Karen are not employed, and their complaints against them aren't ignored with a functioning administration. And so if we care about these kids, we have to do something. 2 suicide attempts, 1 successful, out of a program that had 8 kids in it. That's crazy, And again, people would say, oh, that's an anecdote, this anecdote. It's not in these small programs. Something is clearly wrong with the way these systems are functioning. And I don't pretend to have the answers, but something has to be done. And so I'm just trying to draw attention to this. So I'm not going to name, I will call Karen. I have her name in this letter. I'm not going to read her name here. I'll probably still read the name of the superintendent and the principal, because fuck those guys. And if anyone ends up watching this later and tries to use this against me, I mean it. Fuck those guys. The principal is a completely immoral human being. He shouldn't be where he's at. He got his previous school district sued. And the superintendent, whatever his intentions are, is defending this person, is defending this system. And I get it, by the way, just as a brief aside, the incentives are such, these administrators are here on a 1-year contract. It is not it is not in their favor to rock the boat or to speak out or to try and draw attention, because if they piss off a few teachers, then they're going to, they might not have their contract renewed by the board. And I know we talked about that with that jawbreaker, thing where it's I get it. The incentives are off, but that's not an excuse to be a cowardly fuck. You have one job. If you're the superintendent, you're making $250,000 a year. If you're a principal, you're making 6 figures. That is no excuse to ignore these issues and to be thinking about your career over these kids. It'd be like if a doctor, anytime they went into the operating room, was like, okay, I have to pick between my career and helping this patient. Those two things should not be in tension. And what these administrators have shown is that there is a tension between the best interest of these students and their own careers, or at least they believe there's a tension there, because they're clearly choosing, again, that self-preservation over anything else. So, and by the way, feel free to give me feedback on this. Like I said, I'm submitting it tomorrow. So
okay, I'm sure it's great, but let's hear.
And I'm glad that I'm reading it now at the end and what I wanted to, because I'm completely fried, and so I hopefully I don't think I'll get emotional during it.
Okay.
To whom it may concern, on November 1st, 2021, a young man in our community took his life. He was 15. A few weeks prior, another student at Laramie High School sought to end his own life as well. Fortunately, his attempt at this most permanent and heartbreaking act was unsuccessful. Both of these students and the tragedy of their circumstances can be traced, at least in part, to the catastrophically dysfunctional behavior support program found at Laramie Middle School and its grossly incompetent counterpart at Laramie High School. We worked with the now deceased student during his time at LMS and found him to be a good kid who cared deeply about his friends. During his first semester of his 8th grade year in the fall of 2019, he was enrolled in 2 classes with the Tier 1 behavior support teacher, who would be the subject of multiple complaints regarding issues of extreme instability and dereliction of her classroom and students during class periods. We, along with other staff members, witnessed Karen target and berate this student on numerous occasions. The student confided in us on multiple occasions that this teacher made him feel, quote, worthless, end quote, and that, quote, nothing I do matters, end quote. Long story short, this student did not belong in her classes. His progress went up in every class except the ones with her, and we still have the data charts to prove it. And yet, this unhinged individual would go on to argue that he should be removed from all regular education classes and placed exclusively in the self-contained Behavior 1 support program, predominantly with her. Data was shown that his progress was improving in all regular ed classes and only declining with her. This data was ignored. Karen told me, quote, "A decision has been made. No offense, but this is above your pay grade," end quote. We watched that student's progress deteriorate over the rest of the year. His attitude, motivation, and self-esteem continued to plummet as he spent more and more time in the classroom of an unstable teacher who seemed hell-bent on making his life miserable, or at the very least, indifferent to the consequences of her erratic behavior. The Tier 1 behavior support teacher often lamented the comments this student would make to her regarding the transparently unjust treatment he received at the hands of Karen. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, keeping the peace with this unstable teacher took precedent over the well-being of this and every other student in her care. We won't get into the dishonest and morally bankrupt actions taken by Kevin O'Day and Dr. Yenny in response to complaints about the toxic environment this teacher was creating for students and staff. All that matters here is that they were told in no uncertain terms what was happening in this classroom and the untenable environment she was creating for these most vulnerable of students. Myself, a school psychologist, and the Tier 2 behavior support teacher all filed detailed complaints about Karen. These complaints were ignored. At the end of the school year, she was transferred to the high school, where she would continue to work with students, including the students who had previously been her victims at the middle school. We don't know what the past year or so was like for the student who tragically took his life this week. We don't know if he had any other classes with her. Frankly, none of this is germane to the fact that he spent a year of living hell suffering at the hands of an incompetent, unstable teacher, slowly losing all hope for himself and his life in the process. Is Karen responsible for his death? No, probably not. But did this year of emotional abuse in her care play a role in his overall attitude and will to live? You're damn right it did. The system that was designed to protect him instead put him in the care of an individual who made his life miserable, often through no fault of his own. That same system, when alerted to his situation, ignored his plight, allowed it to worsen, and then allowed his tormentor to continue to work with vulnerable students. This is unacceptable. It took several days to write this. When I close my eyes, I see this student. I see him showing me one of his drawings. He would draw these anime drawings he loved anyway. Or asking my advice about how to help a friend, or just giving that warm smile he had. I see him and I see a casualty of the indifference found throughout the administration of the Albany County School District. With available information, it's difficult to imagine a circumstance where the blame for this tragedy doesn't at least in part fall under a failure of the education system. The other student who attempted to take his life is also a casualty in a different way. He was sent from being self-contained at Laramie Middle School to the high school, where all support was removed and he was allowed to flunk not once but twice due to the gross incompetence of whatever passes for a behavior support program at Laramie High School. These are just two out of many, many other lives who have been permanently and tragically impacted by this district and its administration. It has to stop. We can't allow another completely avoidable tragedy like this to take place. This isn't about going after a specific teacher either. Karen and her failings are merely a symptom of this broken administration. Schools with functioning, competent administrations typically don't employ Karens, and they certainly don't ignore complaints about them. If we want to help our students, particularly the most vulnerable among them, it starts with replacing the ACSD1 administration and going from there. Enough is enough. The choice is ours. For our students' sake, I hope we make the right one.
Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't change a thing. If that doesn't get them, there's no, then they're not committed to justice.
Yeah.
If anybody in that district ever says the word justice again without doing something about this, they're just full of crap.
Yeah, look what's coming off the conveyor belt, right? So I'm going to send that to the Laramie Boomerang tomorrow, and I'm going to work on a copy tonight that's going to go to the school board that has more like names and specifics of the, because I mentioned how they ignored our complaints, but I'm going to mention how that was in direct violation of district policies. And I'm not like, again, I'm not trying to go after this teacher necessarily, but I'm just like, something has to be done.
Yeah.
Something has to be done.
Well, that's the low hanging fruit. But I mean, just like you said, the whole administration needs to go.
Yeah.
There, the number one thing, if I had to pick one thing that facilitates the protection system, like it created it and then facilitates its perpetuation for public schools, is the total lack of accountability.
Yeah.
There is zero accountability in public education in America. It is non-existent. From this case to Charlotte and Mecklenburg schools, where a principal was just sent over to main office after there were too many complaints about him literally accusing female students of making things up when they reported sexual assault cases and trying to cover them up and tell them not to report them because that would look bad on his numbers, I assume. I don't know for a fact. But did they fire him? No. He's just moved down to the main office. And that's just a minor. I mean, by comparison, we've had 15 guns this year in this district. There's nobody's lost their job. Nobody's even been chastised. It's just, business as usual. Oh, well, another day. There's no accountability. So as soon as you remove accountability for actually even sticking to your own policies, what's left?
Exactly. And if people want to see how these institutions function with the same set of incentives and along the exact same like selection process for what ideas and attitudes they select for, take what you just said and look at. So yesterday we get this report out where they say the drone strike that killed a family and civilians in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
They said, that I forgot what the exact wording was, but basically it was no one's fault. That it wasn't a thing, and that no one was held accountable. It's the exact same thing with our education system. And so that's where it's like, once you realize how all of these systems have evolved the same set of parameters, they're going to have these same casualties. They're going to have these same just heartbreaking stories, whether it's you accidentally drone strike a fucking innocent family or kids who are literally being tormented by teachers. That gets ignored, and people who speak out about it are retaliated against and end up losing their job. Like, that's how bad it is. And that's not an oh poor me thing. It's not about me. It's about this kid and the others like him, who are victims of the system. Again, I mean it whenever I say I don't think that this one teacher or the administration, that all of the blame falls on them. I don't. Right. There are certainly other circumstances that are at work here. I don't mean that, but they are absolutely a factor. And the problem is that we don't know how much of a factor, because some factors are determining factors and some aren't. And so we shouldn't even have to ask the question of how much of a factor was the abuse and the untenable circumstances of this kid's education, where he was trusted. He was trusted with these people, by these parents. I don't think the other reason why I'm running this is I don't think his parents know what went on at the middle school when he was there under this person. I don't think they know that I looked at this teacher in the eyes and said, this is a mistake. You're pulling him out of the classes he's succeeding in. And I got told to shut up, basically. I don't think they know. And so it's like, people need to know. People need to know.
And then,
yeah.
Jordan says, and then they tell you that they care about your kids more than you do. And don't you contradict their expertise, you rube.
Yeah.
What have they been telling us? What did the North Carolina Senate Democrats, to one of the Republican members of the Senate, said? He said, we homeschooled our children, all the way through. And he said, oh, I'm sure you've eaten at a restaurant too. That doesn't make you a chef.
Yeah, that's completely ridiculous. Yeah, but that shows the mentality here. Again, look at what is selected. It's this environment of expertise. You see this in again, I use COVID examples a lot, and some people were like, "How come you talk about?" It's like, well, there's some of the best prescient examples where it's like we clearly have institutions in a society that is we have selected for complete trust in whatever
Right.
has been deemed the expert class, whether or not that's warranted, because we stopped looking at what's coming off the conveyor belt a long time ago. And so, like, that's where you get. I saw a tweet after the the election in Virginia where someone said, first the Republicans told people that uh, told their voters that they can do better research than the scientists can, and now they've told them that they know more about teaching than teachers do. Like, expect them to lean into this strategy more, and that person's being serious. It's like it's this laughable thing. Even just look at how voting demographics are broken down. It's like well, college age voters did this. Well, what's the implication? It's you're smarter, you're wiser, you're more educated, which means you're more intelligent. There's this conflation of
Right.
education and intelligence, and it's like that's not necessarily the case. As Michael Malice
No.
says, it's a lot easier to train a smart dog than a dumb dog. My grandparents, my grandpa had, I believe, a fourth grade education, somewhere around there. My grandma, I think, was sixth, and they both dropped out to help work on the family farm. They ended up owning a grocery store, a general store, and a tractor supply dealership. They were extremely sharp. They retired. They had a place in New Mexico that they would go to, and vacation at. And this is with a very minimal level of these educations. Or with education, you hear people talk about like, oh man, so and so was able to do this despite coming from a small school or was a one-room schoolhouse or something like that. Like it's an exception, when really it's like, no, like that says a lot about like how it's not necessarily about like the credentialing or something like that. It's about the
Mhm.
individual. But we have this
Well,
society that has evolved this just I'll end here, that has evolved this worship of the expert class
yeah.
and those who are credentialed versus those who are not. And if you are not like officially credentialed, then you don't officially get an opinion
Mhm.
on any of these things. I don't have a uterus. I haven't been credentialed with that, so I don't get to have an opinion on abortion. Now, of course, unless I'm for it, then in which case I do get to have an opinion.
Well, we
But
also, at the same time that we worship the so-called experts with letters after their names,
correct,
we have those same people who know less than nothing about where food comes from and how it gets to
right,
the grocery store and basic supply chain economics. Like they don't know
right,
anything about that. And yet they will tell us that we're stupid and we're rubes and so forth. And they'll even tell us, what the working class thinks, what the working class wants, what the this class, they love to make proclamations about what everyone who isn't them should do, should think, should want, etc. And what they don't realize is they benefit from the fact that the people making the society in which they have a nice comfy life at their laptop those people were educated decades ago.
yep,
People who are actually making things function and food show up in the store and the trucks on the roads and all that. They didn't come out of school 5 minutes ago. So when
yep,
they're gone, see, it's a delayed reaction, you see. So people are looking around and going, "What? Things are still working? What? You're paranoid. Everything's fine. Education in America is okay. What are you talking about? Look, I go to the grocery store, there's still food there. Okay. And let's see how well it works when the people who are now, 20 barely, okay, they're just coming out of high school when they're 50.
yeah.
Let's let let's
Assuming
let's
there's a country, by the way,
what?
assuming there's a country at that point. But yeah,
If this little well-oiled people widget machine that they have going on here, that the activist machine, whatever the heck they're making in this factory, when they're done making more and more and more of these people widgets or whatever the heck it is they're making now, let's see what the country looks like then.
yeah. There's a so in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek talks about how increasingly he saw people look at the systems that built their society and that created prosperity, and started to view them not as like foundational things that they were dependent on for their circumstances, but actually as barriers
Mhm.
to like further progress. There's this movie, it's a horrible movie, it's really poorly done called City of Ember, with Bill Murray, I think it is. And
It was a good
but
book.
I never read it, but I trust
Yeah, it's good.
your
It's
judgment
a
on
good
that.
book.
I did
Yeah.
know it was based on a book, but
Yeah.
I hadn't read it. But okay, so then the premise. So these people who are down in the city underground,
Mhm.
there is a mayor or whatever, and they have all these systems that keep their city functioning and keep it running. And at some point, they were supposed to go back up to the surface after like the nuclear fallout or whatever had cleared out, but they lost track of when that was. And so they're just down there. And so what you find at least in the, I assume in the book as well, is that there are all these things breaking down because no one knows how they work. No,
Right.
like they've stopped training people to know how these things work. And so people basically, another way of conceptualizing it is that you have a disconnect between the people in society and the things that keep their society going because they take
Mhm.
it for granted. The way
Yep.
I describe that in our society today is using an economic principle called prospect theory, which is basically talks about how people don't value things absolutely. They value things in relative terms. So just one example of prospect theory is like the way you conceptualize the difference between finding $50 versus finding $0, is very different than how you conceptualize if someone were to give you $1,050 versus $1,000. Like that's the same difference, but because of how far the 1,000 versus 1,050 is removed from zero, they feel the same. So the point is the farther removed someone is or something is from absolute zero, um, the the more you're going to have some distortions in how you view the value. And so the point that I make is that as a society, if you were to say North Korea is absolute zero, or like, um, you know, Gilded Age America, whenever like capitalists actually were kind of assholes and there are these factory towns and stuff,
Yeah.
like, if you were to say that I wouldn't call that absolute zero, but if you were to say that we could call that, pretty close to the bottom and compare that to today, like people are so far removed from absolute zero that they don't know what they have. And so they're willing to
No.
gamble with it.
Yeah.
Because you see this a lot with risk aversion. A lot of this comes from Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, which is
Mhm.
basically just him cataloging all of the amazing research he did with Amos Tversky, which is, I highly recommend this book. But people are risk seeking if they don't think they have much to lose, and they're risk averse if they think they have a lot to lose. And so like you see people willing to gamble with their freedoms, with our society, and with everything that we have, because they're so far removed from absolute zero, they don't know exactly what it is they're gambling with. And
Mhm.
so they're risk seeking because they don't think they have a
Right.
lot to lose. And it's like,
Right.
actually, we're really, really far from absolute zero, like
So
crazy
far.
far from
We
absolute
and we have
zero.
people talking about, "I'm traumatized and I'm oppressed by the fact that you braided your hair in a way that is not consistent with your
It's
culture of
billionaires.
origin."
It's billionaires playing Russian roulette for $5.
It's
That's what it
it's
is.
it's
And so,
gross.
because it's like, man, I really think that I need to get this $5. And it might not even be $5, it might be Monopoly money. But either way, they're like, I'm going to play Russian roulette for this because there's this, we used to tell this story back when I did campus ministry, that there was a slave who his owner freed him as part of his will and gifted him his entire estate. I can't remember what this guy's name was, but this is a true story. So he freed his slave and he gives his slave his entire estate.
Oh, right, he
And
goes out and I know the story, yeah.
well, okay, so and then at one point he goes and he asks either there's some proprietor on the property, someone to kind of help him, and he says, "Can I have some money to go buy a loaf of bread?" And the person is like, "You have no idea what you have. You have no idea how wealthy you have," because he didn't understand it, And so like he could buy all the bread he wanted. He didn't know how rich he was, and so then he did. That's a different situation. But the point is that people today, like that guy, actually, once he knew what he had, he appreciated the shit out of it, right? Because he's like, "Oh my god, this is so much better than what I was in." But the kids these days and the people who are willing to gamble with our society, they have no relationship with absolute zero. They have no relationship even with absolute five. And so they're willing to gamble with all of this.
Yep.
And all this goes to what you're saying, like what happens when these kids are the ones put in charge. It's City of Ember.
Yep.
They don't know. And so they're just going to completely destroy it. So that's where I go back to where I'm like, no. It's not about salvaging the APA. It's about building another one. It's about
Right.
building a parallel institution. It's about building a parallel
Right.
institution to all these things, so that whenever those things inevitably collapse on themselves, then we actually have something.
Right.
Then we actually have something
Right.
to
I just I
discuss.
just hope I can stay good and healthy long enough so I don't need to go to one of the doctors that are who are currently
Right?
in medical school. I'm
Well,
very
fortunately, they
nervous.
haven't all been replaced by crazies, right? So I had two really interesting instances um, within about 2 weeks of each other. So one of them, I go to this health clinic to establish primary care, and the nurse, or no, this is a physician actually, super well intentioned, kind lady, very sincere in what she said. She asked me, "Do you have your COVID vaccine?" And I said, "Honestly, I probably would have, but I got COVID, and so I." And she goes, she says, "Oh, no. You still," she goes, "How do I explain it? Um, it's a different kind of, it gives you more protection if you have the vaccine. And actually, there's a really good chance, better than likely chance, that you don't have any protection left from having caught COVID. And so you're probably completely unprotected. And so the only way for you to be protected is to get vaccinated." And like, this woman is dead ass serious saying this, and to something that I know is like basically tantamount to medical malpractice because of how completely insane and afactual it is. And I was like, "Oh, I appreciate that, and like I didn't say anything." So that's a crazy person, right? But she's totally sincere in her beliefs, and that's actually what makes her dangerous. But then my wife, who is now 9 months pregnant, where our second kid is due, or like I think December 4th, so we're less than a month away. And we go into the doctor, we're at this point, we're like visits every week. But this was a visit like maybe, I don't know, 4 weeks ago. Doctor says, "Have you been vaccinated against COVID-19?" And he's like, "You're eligible to get it." And she goes, "No, I already had COVID. So I'm not worried about it." And he goes, "You're fine then." He goes, "I don't know why the natural immunity is just being left out of the conversation. Our benevolent leader, Fauci, doesn't want to talk about natural immunity, but you're fine. You don't need the vaccine then." And so this doctor is perfectly sane and normal, and I'm like, holy shit, like, that's great. Like, I feel so much better about you delivering our kid. So yes, I don't want to see what, like, woke medicine, is in practice, like
Right.
when I'm under the knife. But fortunately, the previous class of people who are competent um, have not been completely replaced by a new generation of people that are not competent at the task that they're supposedly credentialed in. And that's why I say we need new credentialing
Well,
mechanisms
yeah, and
ASAP.
we need to just create new systems and like you said, get
Right.
started doing it right now because and I always go back. I mean, I'm nostalgic and I always go back to the founding of the country and I go back to the founders and how they were just such a tiny band of rebels. They were
Yep.
really actually a very small group and, they came together years before the actual revolution and the declaration and so forth. And they came while they were sort of from a similar milieu, they didn't have everything in common, except for their, desire to, do something else and go in a different direction. And then through, pamphleteering and, all kinds of other ways,
And
they just
debate.
and debate and things like
Yep.
that, they started a movement. Now,
Yep.
it didn't suck that they were risking their lives and their their fortunes to do it. But in other words, that's compelling. I mean, I think when people
Yep.
see a bunch of guys who otherwise are pretty well fixed saying we got to do something, it's compelling. And in fact, I think it's one of the reasons the woke are so successful is most of their champions are extremely wealthy, extremely well off.
Yep.
They presuppose that, well, they must know something and they're taking a risk. Like, we have to go green and all this. So they think, oh, they're taking a big risk because they make money. What they don't see is in this particular case, they've figured out ways well in advance of how they're going to capitalize. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. So I prefer to think of myself more as one of them, and that we're just trying to go on and start, living like Americans again.
Yep.
No,
The
America didn't
progression.
die. It's just kind of dormant.
Right. That's where actually I say that there's still hope, is because our Constitution is still intact, for the
Right.
most part. And so um, the Civil Rights Act poses issues that not because I think segregation is a good thing, but because it basically created a system where the government can intervene and like lots of things that they shouldn't be able to intervene in. But that, and anyone can just, like, the Civil Rights Act is really, it's not written well, even though the intentions were good and things that we all agree with. I have to add that asterisk because there's a very uncharitable interpretation of what I just said. But my point is that my hope is, largely intact because the Constitution is largely intact. But the progression goes something like this. Okay, so we need free and competent and independent institutions. Okay. Well, in order to do that, we need free and competent and independent. First it's credentialing. In order to get the credentialing, because the people who are like the petroleum engineers and stuff are kind of the things we need in society to keep society going, right? Like we need neurosurgeons, we need physicists.
Until we can crack that whole fission, fusion, whatever
fusion.
that code,
yeah. Until we can turn
do that,
water
like, here's
into,
a pellet. This powers your car for the rest of your life.
Well, Doc Brown did it with trash, but anyway,
whatever.
So we need to be able to credential, because the institutions right now that are churning out the people destroying society are also the same ones credentialing the people that keep society going. And so we need to not do that. We need institutions that are credentialing people who are competent. Okay, so in order to do that, you have to have free and independent institutions that are competent. Okay, in order to do that, you have to have free and independent accrediting mechanisms in order to build those institutions. In order to have that, you have to have free and independent locations. You have to have soil in which to plant those seeds and to build those things. In other words, if someone said, okay, I've got investors, I've got the people, we have the faculty, we have everything. We're going to go and we're going to start a new university that's going to focus exclusively on and just go back to the basics. We're not going to do any of this identity stuff. Okay, where are you going to build it? San Francisco. What the fuck are you talking about? No, you will not do that, right? That would be like planting a seed in toxic radioactive soil.
Exactly.
So this is where the part where I'm increasingly like, elections don't matter, but the local elections, any election that you could say falls under the column of maintains or creates fertile soil for these institutions, that's an election that matters. That's actually the only elections that matter. Elections that create fertile soil for these functioning institutions to be created, for parallel institutions created, those are the only ones that matter, because we're not going to salvage the ones that exist. We can only create new ones, and we can't create new ones unless we have the proper soil to plant them in. So that's the progression.
What a great place to end, Truman. We can't create the right institutions unless we have the soil, the fertile soil to plant them in. And to a certain degree too, that's our own minds. So we have to start spending less time putting that toxic crap inside our brains and like focusing on all the negative. I mean, we have to talk about it a little bit to just keep new people becoming aware of it, just like make sure that people are, as you said, they're sort of slowly waking up. It's kind of like a slow, long process. So we have to keep mentioning it. We keep bringing it up and educating people. But I want to spend less and less time there. If for no other reason, I'm not a masochist. I'm sick and tired of it.
Can I tell you one of the best not just mental health, but intellectual decisions that I made in the last year, and this will probably be something that will resonate with your audience, is I stopped listening to Ben Shapiro every day. I actually don't listen to any conservative pundit, anyone like that on a regular basis. Well, a lot of people do, listen to like some of those guys, I think some of the stuff that Ruben does is pretty decent occasionally, but I stopped keeping up with the stuff that is up here.
Yeah.
It's like the reactionary stuff that's just telling you the APA tweeted this out, it's like, okay, what does that mean for me? Like, you might as well have told me Kim Jong-un like starved some people. Like, no shit. Like, this is not the thing to focus on. We know these things are fucked. And so my advice to your audience would be, one, to stop thinking about these things as broken, but two, if we want to think about them properly, is to not get caught up in that little like minutia of being distracted with the things that don't matter.
They don't matter. And
it's not that they don't matter. It's that we can't do anything about them.
No, it's
And
just
so
one more
because of that,
example. It's one more
exactly.
example. It's one more example. And
Exactly.
the only reason to talk about it is if it helps you explain a phenomenon that's otherwise challenging. Like you said, it takes like one line of bullshit, but you need, a whole paragraph or a chapter to explain what it really means. Sometimes I'll cover, things that come up because I think to myself, maybe this will help me explain it better, or show an example of this
different
or that or the
angle
other.
kind of thing.
A different angle, because this stuff is complicated, and so, especially when you're talking about school things, it's complicated, and sometimes people need to see it 7 or 8 times in different formats to be like, oh my god, it just clicked.
100%.
It just clicked. I just get it. So, but other than that, just to do it, just to go look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that, it on top of being boring, it doesn't really move you forward. It doesn't do anything.
It's a distraction.
Yeah, it actually is what if there's a they, okay, let's say there's a they in charge of the gun
There's
factory.
absolutely a they.
Right.
And it's what they like. They love that.
And they love it. They would love nothing more than for people to just, like OD on that crap and just get super distracted by it. Because then they aren't spending any energy focusing on how to do better, like how to overcome it. And it's exactly, if you think about it, the irony is it's the exact same thing as what critical theory does to children. It's saying like, be awake, be awake, be awake, be awake, be awake. And so you're super awake. And what are you, angry
over here
and afraid? And things have only gotten worse. So it's not to be, you shouldn't be awake and angry just to be awake and angry. You should be thinking to yourself like, okay, I thank you for reminding me that I'm a free individual and that my children are mine and that I have a role to play in their childhoods. And we're going to be going now. It's like, that's all I want to do is just help people see that it's not just that stuff. It's, as you pointed out, it's the whole system is functioning exactly as designed. The way I talk about it often on the channel is I say, you're working on a different project than they are. That's been how I've articulated it. Like whatever project
100%.
you had in mind when you had that little baby, like your baby's about to be born and you have your little girl, right? So when you had those kids, you had some idea in your head of what project you were working on as far as raising them, what that would look like, what it would sound like, what kind of lessons you would teach in the home. And all you need to know really is they're working on a completely different thing than you. Y'all are not on the same page. And when it finally sinks in and you get back in touch with what this project was, it actually becomes, as you said, what becomes easier, how it's sort of easier to make certain decisions. Well, that makes the decision to walk away easier too.
100%.
Decision to live free is you're like, well, I'm deeply in touch with the project I want to work on. I don't care if they're making guns or mattresses or sewing machines, or it doesn't really matter. It's kind of irrelevant because I got to go over to where I can continue to work on the project that I defined, wherever that might be. But I'm going to go find it or make it or build it or whatever, because that's my values. And that's it. That's all it is once. And if you listen to Ben Shapiro all day, or you listen to, all these people all day, you won't have that headspace and that quiet to get in touch with, what am I doing here for me, for my kids, for my life? It's just, I'm busy getting angry. Well, super. That's going to make you real easy to control.
It will make you easy to control, and in a way that is useful for the people that you are ostensibly
not
opposed
useful to you.
There was
you still don't know what you want to be doing.
Or worse, you do know what you want to be doing and you think you're doing it, but you're not. And so like there was another saying we would use whenever I did collegiate ministry was, emotion is no substitute for action, and action is no substitute for production. Production is no substitute for reproduction. So just because I feel a thing doesn't mean I did something about it. Just because I did something doesn't mean it was useful. Just because I did something that was useful doesn't mean it's iterable, like it's iterative, right? You want it to be useful and iterative and enduring.
Yeah.
And so the problem with these distractions is that they get you riled up, and you confuse the emotion with action. And and what ends up happening, and I'm as big a fan as a "Let's Go Brandon" meme as anyone else. I think it's probably one of the greatest things that's ever happened. But I did a job for a guy who had a flag outside of his house that actually just said "fuck Joe Biden" and "fuck you too" if you voted for him. And I looked at that and I was like, you were talking about the day. I'm like, there are people who are ecstatic that there are so many people who think that the majority of their problems start and end at whether or not we have a mentally compromised dude in the Oval Office. Because if you think that that's where the problem is, then it's like that's great for the people who are actually in charge. They're like, yes, let's go, Brandon, indeed. Because when Brandon's gone, then you're going to think that the problem is gone, and you're going to be off by multiple orders of magnitude. And this is another Curtis Yarvin quote, but he said, if your opponent if your opponent looks at you and sees that your assessment of the problem is off by multiple orders of magnitude, your opponent doesn't have to do anything. They can just let you
Exactly.
spin your wheels and do your
Exactly.
little thing and have your controlled opposition and fume and post shit on Facebook or whatever, and it's no change at all. And so the minute you unplug from that and do like what you've suggested doing here and start thinking about real practical solutions,
hmm
now you're in a different realm. Now you're
Right.
thinking about
And
solutions that are actually
and you're not
appropriate
gonna
for the
and you're
problems we're
you're not
dealing with.
likely to change like the whole country or the world, but like look at what can you change in your own life like tomorrow
Exactly. Yep.
and for your
Yep.
own children or whatever, and try to do that and then replicate that a bunch of times and see how that goes. Because it's if everybody did that, we wouldn't be here.
Yep.
So
Part of,
anyway.
no, we can close it out, but just one thing I'll say is that part of the problem of deprogramming leftist thought from your mind, which is kind of, as Bridget Fennessy has said, called it, the default settings that we all are often kind of entered into in society, is part of that thinking. It's not just like facts and like,
Yeah.
how do I think about economics, or how do I think about history, or how do I think about like the 2008 housing crisis or something like that. It's how do I think about systems. And part of the leftist like progressive ideology, Eric Weinstein has called it malware. He's like, I've got so much fucking malware in my head and I didn't put it there, but I know it's there.
hmm
Part of the malware that we have to kind of get out of our head is we are trained to think top down institutionally. That's how we conceptualize things. And so once we come out of that, what you want to call it, red pilling or, red peeling or whatever, is that part of our, kind of deprogramming from that has to include deprogramming from our understanding of systems, that is in that mindset. And so, because if you go, the left has control. I don't want to, the left, we'll just say these people who suck and are fucking everything up. Like, I don't like using that left, right, binary, but call it the cathedral, whatever. Like, they have control of all of these institutions,
Yeah.
and they have the, if you come at this with a problem solving mindset that is a top down, like institutional mindset, like you're bringing a thumbtack to a tank fight, to a nuke fight, man. Like, you're just
Yeah.
not going to do it. And so part of that deprogramming has to be exactly what you said there, which is like, okay, not only are like the axioms like wrong, but like the way I think about these systems and how things should be done is also
hmm
probably wrong.
Yep.
And that if I really care about efficacy and solutions, it has to start on a local level. And even that is no guarantee of success. Just
Right.
look at my story,
Well, right,
here
and
in
I
this
tried it with my
community.
kids' school. I tried with
Right.
the teachers one at a time. I tried, being giving them all the benefit of the doubt that I was
Yep.
misunderstanding. Like maybe it's me and I misheard
Right.
or I misread or something. Like, help me understand how this helps. And as soon as I got this pushback of like, shut up, go away, you bother me, kid, I was like, what? Okay,
Yep.
I'm the mom here.
Yep.
Like, I'm the mom, not you.
Yep.
And, it sunk in. I always knew it was going to be less than I wanted it to be for my kids, but at the same time, I didn't think it would be dangerous. And
Yep.
I came up against that, and that's a whole other topic for another day, but, I
Right.
I had a kid who almost died and,
Hmm.
situations that started at school. So, It's an issue near and dear to my heart, but I've decided that the way to deal with it is to not deal with it, not
Yep.
be part of it, not have anything to
Yep.
do with it. It's just
Opt out of
like,
the system.
yeah,
If
bye
someone
bye.
framed it a different way and said, would you play a game against an opponent that controlled the rules, controlled the scoreboard, controlled the playing field, and all of these other things? Would you play that game? Like, you would go, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. Why would I participate in that? And then if someone said, okay, well, that's what you're up against whenever it comes to X, Y, or Z institution or thing that you're trying to change here. Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So then maybe I need to not play this game. Maybe I
that
need to
might
come up
be
with a
good.
different game or find some people that
Right.
agree to a set of rules ahead of time and we can play that game. But the idea of like remaining under an umbrella or like continually opting into a system just because of some, like you mentioned, taxes, like some sunk cost fallacy type thing, where it's like, well, I paid for it, so I'm going to continue to let, my CDs are in his truck, so I'm going to keep letting him beat the shit out of me, or whatever type of thing is just ludicrous. Like, there's all these ways to reframe this for people that
Yeah.
they understand, but it's just,
And if
it's
people
harder.
actually look to, I mean, I don't love paying the amount of taxes that we pay that goes towards the school. It's about 45% of my property tax goes to the school
Good
that I
God.
don't use. But even so, if I looked at the dollar figure, and it's not, chump change. For us, it's a lot less than in New York or New Jersey or some of these states, California. But compared to my child's life,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you like,
It's a
how much
song.
is your
It's nothing.
child's brain worth to you?
Yep.
Because really
And
that's what it's coming down to. Like, is your child's brain worth $1,000 a year? Like, is it? Because,
yep,
mine is.
you can look at it as paying a tribute. It's like, I live under a king and the king demands a tribute from me. And
Right.
with that
They're not getting
tribute,
my kid in tribute.
exactly. With that tribute, I can opt my kid into the king's military service, or I can keep the kid at home. I have to pay the tribute either way. But if I think about it like that and say, look, this is what it is, maybe I can move to a place where the tribute is smaller, or it's cut up differently, or I'm more happy with what the tribute goes to. But you have to pay the tribute no matter what. But you don't have to also partake in the thing that the king says, well, because of this tribute, you can join my army and become one of my soldiers. You don't
Right.
have to do that. But if you think about it like that, and exactly like you said, it's like, is your kid's brain worth this much? It's like, yeah, just because you're forced to pay the tribute doesn't mean you have to enlist them in the king's army.
Exactly. So guys, take that to the bank. check
Yep.
your check that and ask yourself how to value your child's life and mental health and brain capacity and all that kind of stuff. So, Truman, I cannot thank you enough. This has been aside from the tragic event that prompted this conversation, I think you've given us a lot to chew on in terms of wonderful analogies and fantastic um just paradigms, like the way that you've laid this out for us to think about it is really, really helpful. I know it's one of the longer interviews we've done, and I hope that other people watch it on the replay, and people here, if you could share this out. I will try to make some clips now that I have my good computer and I can actually do it. I will try to grab some of the key points because this is really important information for thinking. It's not just like you said, it's not just going to like piss people off. That's not our goal. Our goal is to help people think about these topics in a productive way that
Right.
can actually help their lives. Not I'm not saying like go out and save the country, but like your life, your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews, the children you haven't had yet, whatever it is, or even just your life. If you don't have kids, but you're a taxpayer, you are still living in a country that will be run by these children
Yep.
when they grow up. So that you have skin in the game too. So if you can start to think about these things in a little different way, I think it will become much easier to think about what to do about it in your life. Again, in your life, I'm not suggesting that you go out and as you said, you're not gonna win against this giant dragon or whatever the heck it is.
Right.
That's that. Just try to find a path over the mountain away from where the dragon lives.
Yeah. You
So
it's much more fruitful to try and exit their periphery, their line of sight, and get in a
exactly.
blind spot than it is to try and slay the dragon.
Exactly.
And there's other people trying to slay the dragon. Let them try. But,
yeah. Maybe we'll get lucky, but while they're busy doing that,
yep.
I've just made my decision. So anyway,
Yep.
but I can't thank you enough. You're fantastic. And I hope you feel better. By the way, everybody, Truman gave his time to us tonight, not feeling well. So he's sick and he did all of
I've
this
been
amazing
coughing
work.
I'm coughing so much shit out of my lungs. I swear to God, I've talked about how I picked up this head cold from it's actually my brother-in-law. I gave it to his daughter who gave it to my daughter. Anyway, I'd rather have COVID again than whatever the fuck this is. This is awful.
Yeah, well, I am really
But
sorry. Try some, if you have a nebulizer, try saline or just sit in a steamy room. Sometimes that helps, but the old fashioned stuff I find helps better. But I'm going to let you go so you
sure.
can
Can,
go rest
can I
up.
plug? Can I just plug some stuff really
Oh my
fast
God, I'm
before I
sorry.
dip?
I'm like, that's like you're supposed to do at the end of the show. And I'm going,
That's okay.
like, please.
So everyone, especially with the specifics of this, I looked in. You can check on Twitter. The Laramie Boomerang hasn't tweeted, like our newspaper hasn't tweeted anything out for like a couple months, and so it's like I'm gonna tweet this at them. They don't have DMs open, so I'm also gonna have to email them directly, and maybe go down to the office. In a small town, it's only like
Right.
8 blocks that way. But if you could please, follow me on Twitter, it'd be nice. But at the very least, be on the lookout for whenever I tweet this letter out. And if you can retweet it, just so we can get eyeballs on it, I'd really appreciate that. That's again going to be tomorrow. My Twitter is at My Mundane Mind. Look at you, Deb. Thank you. You're reading my mind. You're reading my mundane mind, and so that's where you can find me on Twitter. My locals community is returntoreason.locals.com, and then on
That's right.
YouTube,
It's
Return to Reason.
.locals.com. That's all through the YouTube channel. So it's
Yep. So that's YouTube is Return to Reason. I'm very shit at updating that, but my locals is the one where you can find most of my stuff. So if you feel like support me or seeing just the random stuff that comes out of my head, I appreciate that. But the main thing, honestly, is whenever I tweet that letter out, if you could retweet it.
So keep your eyes peeled on My Mundane Mind on Twitter, and then we'll just retweet the heck out of it because it needs to be read. And and definitely follow Truman's channels and support him on Locals, and share the video out so other people can get the message.
Yep.
So
that's
thank
the main
you.
thing.
Thank you, Truman.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you for letting me tell this story.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to platform anything you have to tell us. It's always mind expanding, and it helps. Strangely enough, it's hard to imagine a conversation like this could result in hope, but for me, it did. I don't have hope for that system, but I have hope for people in general, because you exist, and Seth and other people who are, all the people in our audience here, everybody listening and commenting here. So it helps me. It's kind of therapeutic to realize that there are people who hear this and they get it and they want it to be different,
and they care.
So they do. They care.
Yep.
So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who came tonight and spent all this time with us. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time.
Likewise. Peace.